in a forthcoming election. That was Shimon Peres. Until her final debacle, she generally found ways of getting her own way. There had been a Lionel Bart musical called Maggie May, and the saying went, "Others may not, but Maggie may," and that was very much her watchword. I saw her from time to time after she left office. On one occasion I attended a social event, and when I came in she bustled over to me. I'd recently had published in a newspaper an article about protecting children from pornography on TV and videos. She told me how much she admired the article and said, "I carry it with me everywhere in my handbag." Mr. Speaker, to be part of the contents of Margaret's handbag, what greater apotheosis could one possibly hope for?
Sir Gerald Howarth.
Mr. Speaker, this is a sad day for those of us who were privileged to serve as either officers or, in my case, as a foot soldier in Margaret Thatcher's great army. But as the Leader of the Opposition said in what I thought was a very generous speech, this is also an opportunity for the nation to pause, reflect and recall the extraordinary achievements she secured in just 11 years. And when she won the 1979 election, many of my colleagues were not around at the time to remember. They're so young. But we older ones do remember the rubbish piled up in the streets, the corpses that went unburied, and an industry which was being held to ransom by the likes of Red Robbo. And so Britain was basically a basket case. The Chancellor of the Exchequer recalled from an aeroplane at Heathrow to come and answer the IMF. And so she arrived as a new breed, not just a woman, but, as the Prime Minister said, a conviction politician who was driven by a belief that Britain deserved better and that the British people themselves deserve better. She didn't need a focus group, I have to say, to decide what she believed in. She was driven by a set of very clear conservative principles, underpinned by a fundamental belief that it would be free enterprise which delivered the prosperity that she so craved for our people in the aftermath of the Second World War and the malaise which the Prime Minister made reference. When I became a Shadow Minister in 2002, I got, of course, a handwritten note congratulating me and saying, know your facts. So, Mr. Speaker, in that spirit, I am going to just remind the House of a couple of facts. She believed in sound money, as the Prime Minister said, and in her time, the public sector borrowing requirement fell from 4.1% of GDP to 1%. The national debt was cut from 43.6% to 26.7% of GDP. And she took on the trade union barons and restored the trade unions to their members. And it's very interesting to look at the figures. There were in 1979 29.8 million days lost in industrial action, or strikes to you and me. That was cut by the time she left office to 2 million. And last year it was less than 250,000 days. Such has the change that this divisive woman has wrought in industrial relations in our country. She also abolished exchange controls. I once went on a demonstration when I was running the Society for Individual Freedom. I went on a demonstration outside the Bank of England with a placard saying "End exchange controls." This was about 1972. Didn't really understand exactly what it was all about. I hadn't then embarked on my banking career, but I had some sort of vague notion that it was a sort of ghastly sort of Second World War regulation. And the first thing that she did, or Geoffrey Howe did, when he became Chancellor of the Exchequer, he abolished exchange controls. And for those of our young people who don't understand, like I didn't, what we're talking about, in those days, when you went abroad, you had you were allowed to take 30 quid out of the country, and you had to have your passport stamped saying you were entitled to take 30 quid out of the country. And so it is important that we take this opportunity to remind people of the changes that have been wrought. I was in a bank, working in the bank at the time. I took all those regulations from exchange controls. I took them all off the shelves. I have them at home to remind myself and anybody else who might also need reminding of the iniquity of exchange controls. She also ended the party line, which was not the, of course, line from central office every morning that we are so privileged to receive. The party line, again, I remind some of those who are slightly younger. We had a party line at home. It meant that your telephone, which was graciously provided by something called the General Post Office, and you picked up your telephone, and if your neighbour with whom you shared a party line was on the phone, you put your phone down. And I remember in the late 1990s, all those smart-suited, Armani-suited New Labour types clutching their mobile phones. Don't forget, friends, comrades, if it hadn't been for us privatising the telecommunications industry, you wouldn't have had your mobile phone. Yes, it's all right. The Shadow Chancellor can phone a friend. Trouble is, he hasn't got one. Sorry, that was a bit divisive. But also, and we've heard her other achievements domestically. She didn't do everything. In the No Turning Back group, and of course we, my right-on friend for Hitchin and Harpenden and my right-on friend for Wokingham and many others in the No Turning Back group, were urging on her to go further and faster. And we were called the Don't Turn Your Back group for some obscure reason. But we did urge her to go further. And I remember we put to her a proposal that we might, in education, have a system whereby the money followed the pupil. And she told us at this NTB dinner, she said, "Grow up, boys, and be your age. We can't possibly do anything like that." So we were all crestfallen and went home thinking, well, this is very disappointing. The Prime Minister hasn't listened. Well, come the general election 1987, you know, out there canvassing all day long. You turn on the telly at night, see what's going on at the centre. There's a press conference in the morning, the Prime Minister in the middle, and Ken Baker to her side. And she said, "And Ken, we've got this new idea about education. The money follows the pupil." And I said, "But that's what we proposed to her." And she told us to grow up. We couldn't possibly do anything like it. And that was the art of Margaret Thatcher's political argument of which the Prime Minister spoke. But she did challenge you, and she did make sure that you got your facts right, and she challenged that, and she found that it was a policy worth pursuing. Abroad, of course, she forged that closer relationship with Ronald Reagan in the United States, a story which my right honourable learned friends mentioned about Ronald Reagan is, I heard it from Bob Tuttle, the former American ambassador. Absolutely right. They really did admire her. She was no poodle to the United States, though. She challenged them, and that's what they admired about her. And she did end the Cold War, and I think it's terribly important that we do understand that at that time we all felt a sense of potential nuclear holocaust. Absolutely. And together with Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, they made the world a better place and liberated millions of Eastern Europeans who had been subjected to tyranny. So again, this divisive lady, responsible for introducing harmony across the Iron Curtain, and that will to recover the Falkland Islands is now legendary, and I wear with pride my Falkland Islands tie today as a symbol of that determination by Margaret Thatcher. And that extraordinary engendering of a new respect across the world for the United Kingdom had commercial advantage. One of the biggest deals that was ever done was the Al Yamama defence deal with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which today is worth tens of billions of pounds, sustaining high-tech jobs across the kingdom. And she had a huge part to play in that. And many people believe, if they remember, she went there observing all the courtesies of the Arab world: long dress, long sleeves, scarf. But I'm quite sure that when she flashed her eyes at King Fahd, it was all a done deal. And the liberation of Kuwait, of which we've heard again, and the winning of the EU rebate. And that's, again, instructive. She had a simple message. That was one of her secrets. She had a simple message for the country. And do you remember Robin Day had that interview with her and said, gave a long thing about how all her belligerence was going to off-put our European partners over her determination to get the rebate. And she paused and said, after this great spiel, she paused and said, "But Robin, it's our money. We want it back." To date, £75 billion we got back. So let no one deny her the pomp and circumstance of next week's Of course, she did fall out over Europe. And she did sign the Single European Act, as Honourable Member for Belfast North mentioned. I didn't sign it, I wasn't a minister, but I did actually vote against it at third reading. And I did say to her, when I became her PPS, I said, a lot of people in the House are saying, Margaret, that your belligerence on Europe is hardly justified when you signed the Single European Act. And she said to me, yes, I did sign it, but I understood it to apply solely to the single market in goods and services. And what I was assured that it wouldn't be extended to working time and other areas. And it was that I was betrayed, the fact that I was betrayed. That is why I feel so passionately about it. And she was a fervent patriot. She profoundly believed in this country. She loved this country. And she did not wish to sign up to a United States of Europe, and nor do I, and nor do my right honourable and honourable friends on this side of the House. But of course we weren't alone in that. I remember a conversation in this lobby. This was not seen by any of the media. This was just myself, Lady Thatcher, Mrs. Thatcher as she then was, Mr. Benn, Tony Benn, and the Honourable Member for Bolsover. And it was absolutely marvellous hearing the entire expression of unity about how evil, as it were, the common market was in the way that it was trying to drive the United States of Europe. So she lost office. I was her parliamentary private secretary after she lost office. She was angry. People around the world couldn't understand it. And it's important to remember, she was never beaten by the British people. She was never even beaten by the Conservative Party. 54% of us voted for her, but it was 4 votes short of the majority that was required. And I do think the Conservative Party and the country suffered in consequence of that. And I congratulate my Right Honourable Friend, the Prime Minister, in doing all that he can to try to revive those Thatcherite principles that did so much to revive our country in the 1980s. I will tell you one story, Mr. Speaker, if you, and then I will wind up. But I must tell you this a wonderful story. I went down to see her after I lost my seat in Staffordshire, and I said, "What are you doing this weekend, Margaret?" This is 1992, and she said, "Well, I'm going to Paris. I'm going to have dinner with President Mitterrand." I said, what are you going to say? He says, "I'm going to tell him that if France signs the Maastricht Treaty, France est mort." So I said, "Well, I think actually it's La France." Yes. So she said, "La France est mort." I think, well, because it's La France, you have to say morte. So she went round the room saying, "La France est morte, La France est morte." So she went off to dinner with President Mitterrand on that weekend. And it is no coincidence, in my view, that on Monday morning, President Mitterrand announced that France would hold a referendum on the Maastricht Treaty. The eyes of Caligula and the mouth of Marilyn Monroe, maybe. I was told that if I didn't distance myself from Margaret Thatcher after losing my seat in 1992 in Cannock and Burntwood, that I would never get a seat again.
Exactly.
However, I had a wonderful letter from Enoch Powell, who said, "My dear Gerald, hard luck but be of good cheer. Fidelity to persons or to principles is seldom unrewarded. Thank you to the people of Aldershot, who rewarded me by offering me the first seat that came up after the 1992 general election." And I think that rather worried number 10 at the time. But I have not changed my principles. I have been supporter of Margaret Thatcher from the very first time that she put her name forward to be leader of our party. And I do not regret that. I think she has been the salvation of the nation. I think she has restored our position in the world. And none of us can forget her extraordinary elegance. I remember coming to the chamber about 4 o'clock in the morning, an all-night sitting. None of you lot know what an all-night sitting is all about. Well, we used to have it regularly. 4 o'clock in the morning, and you'd had a bit to drink, and you got that feeling, us chaps, a bit of stubble, and it was really pretty unpleasant. Sitting on the front bench over there, wondering when is this all going to end, as purgatory. And then there was a frisson on the back of the chair. All of a sudden, in walked the Prime Minister. Not a hair out of place, handbag there, smiling, and you sort of slid up your bench and looked at the Prime Minister and say, here I am. She was an inspiration to us all. She inspired huge loyalty. Bob Kingston, her personal protection officer, once said to me when I asked him what it was like working for her, he said, I would catch bullets between my teeth to save that woman. The soldiers whom she so admired, they reciprocated and they admired her. I was at the Painted Hall for the 25th anniversary of the Falklands campaign. A lot of people who'd been injured mentally or physically were there. When Margaret Thatcher got up to leave, there was the most astonishing roar from men who'd been maimed, cheering their warrior leader who had instructed them to go into battle, and they wanted to pay their tribute to her. And she showed immense kindness, as people have said. In my case, when Neil Hamilton and I faced extinction after we were defamed by the BBC Panorama programme, took a bit of time to see the chairman of the party, happened to be Norman Tebbit, but it took only a couple of days to see the Prime Minister. For 25 minutes she listened. At the end, she said, turned to the Chief Whip, John Wakeham, and said, these are members of our party in good standing. Please ensure that they get the necessary support. We got that support. We won our libel action. And the Director General of the BBC was fired as a result of Margaret Thatcher's kindness. I think that we were able to resume our political careers here. Mr. Speaker, I will close by quoting from Enoch Powell, because he, at the time of the Falklands campaign, he made a very interesting observation. Before the campaign, he said that the Iron Lady was going to be tested. And then on the 17th of June, he said to the Prime Minister, is the Right Honourable Lady aware that the report has now been received from the public analyst on a certain substance recently subjected to analysis, and that I have obtained a copy of the report? It shows that the substance under test consisted of ferrous matter of the highest quality, that it is of exceptional tensile strength, is highly resistant to wear and tear and to stress, and may be used with advantage for all national purposes. What advantage the nation had in the leadership of Margaret Thatcher, the greatest peacetime Prime Minister this nation has ever seen. And next week we will have our opportunity to give her the send-off that she so fully deserves for her selfless sacrifice to the nation.
Michael Meacher.
I very much endorse the measured and dignified remarks of my right honourable friend, the leader of the opposition, and I just want very briefly to add to them in two ways. First and most important, I want to be a voice for my constituents, and I also want to speak as someone who has been a member of this House from the very start when Margaret Thatcher first became Conservative Party leader and then Prime Minister. Now, I think almost everyone agrees that in 1979 Britain was set on a course which could not go on and demanded radical change. At times of deep crisis, I think the whole country rallies behind a unifying leader. Whether it is Churchill in wartime or Attlee in peacetime, constructing a peace which breaks with the despair of the 1930s. But Mrs. Thatcher was a very different kind of leader. She was someone who took the fight to her opponents, who deployed a scorched earth policy to destroy them, which polarised the country, which is why even still today she is lionised in the South as we have heard repeatedly this afternoon, but remembered with a very different memorial in the north. The task in 1979 certainly required a dominant personality to shake this country out of its somnolent conservatism. I think we all agree. And whatever else, Mrs. Thatcher was certainly a dominant figure. She dominated, or came to dominate, her cabinet, her party, the country, and her influence was indeed felt across much of the world. And in that context, I would recall a story I recently heard when I was sharing a speech with my very good friend, John Gummer, now Lord Deben. Maybe I got the pronunciation wrong. He was complaining because as Environment Secretary in the 1980s, he couldn't get his department to take climate change seriously. So he rang Mrs. Thatcher, as she then was, in order to ensure that he had the necessary support. Yeah. And when he had explained, Mrs. Thatcher said to him, "John, you really shouldn't worry. There are two persons in the cabinet who are committed over climate change, you and me. So we're in a majority." But dominance should always have a counterpart in concern for the victims of radical change. One should never destroy without then building up again. And too many industries, too many working class communities across the north were laid waste during those years without any alternative and better future being constructed to replace what had been lost. And many of those are still desolated today. In Oldham, the textile industry was wiped out, and a whole swathe of some of the country's finest engineering companies were simply swept away. Yes, I think we agree on these benches that change, even painful change, is often necessary. But it should not be bought at the price of the tripling of unemployment, the tripling of child poverty, and the rise of an unacceptable increase in inequality which is still with us today. My office in Oldham received, and I'm sure many other members did as well, dozens and dozens of phone calls and emails from my constituents. And I just want to quote one of them in the exact words of her email. And this is what she said. "Despite what her supporters think, a lot of today's problems result from her policies. The destruction of our manufacturing base, the lack of investment in social housing following the sale of council homes, deregulating the banking industry, privatised industries, profiteering at our expense. We are still living with the consequences." And then she went on, "I'm sure a large percentage of the population who lived through her years in power will feel the same." And she ended, "I hope that my views will be represented in Parliament today." Now, Lady Thatcher will undoubtedly be remembered as a leader of great conviction. There is no doubt about this. But greatness, in my view, has to be tempered with generosity and magnanimity if one is to earn a permanent place in the heart of this nation. And I simply conclude by saying this. That same unwavering conviction which she possessed so magnificently, I think sets an example for every generation in confronting the problems that challenge them. And this generation is confronted by very different problems today. The straitjacket of prolonged austerity, the lack of accountability of corporate power, the over-dominance of finance, a grossly unjust system of remuneration, and the destruction of the public realm. But it is to Lady Thatcher's credit, and I mean this very genuinely and forcefully, that she has shown us that We should not be daunted by problems on this scale and magnitude, but we should tackle them head on and indeed overcome them with the same flame of conviction and resolution which remains her greatest memorial.
Mrs. Gerald Gillan.
Mr. Speaker, the legion of tributes today, the international response, and even the distasteful celebrations of her sad death mark out Margaret Thatcher from all other politicians in this country. But it's also remarkable to note that she was only the second woman on the Conservative benches to ever serve at cabinet level, which makes her achievements even more impressive. She was a woman of great contrasts. I think of her, you can say she bestrode the world stage like a colossus. But she was also capable of great empathy and compassion. A woman who was not only a politician, but proud of her role as daughter, wife, mother and grandmother. And our thoughts in this House should be with her family and her close relatives today. I'm afraid I came into this House, Mr. Speaker, just as she left, so it is with great sadness that I never got to serve on these green benches alongside her. And for me, she was a sort of cross between my mother and my headmistress. She was a woman to be loved and admired, but also feared. A woman to hold up as an example for others, but who would expect you to follow her. For someone with a reputation of wanting to be the only woman in the cabinet room, I found that she was both inspiring and personally encouraging to other women, particularly those that wanted to enter politics. It was as a direct result of her comments to me as I sat next to her at a dinner back in 1979 that she made me believe I too could serve my country as an MP. And I think from some of the speeches we've heard today and those that will follow later, we will know that she had that sort of effect on many people, empowering them to achieve their full potential. But it was also that clearly defined philosophy and that stubborn adherence to her own beliefs that fashioned the opinions of both her admirers and her detractors. Now, my predecessor in Chesham and Amersham was one such detractor, calling his book on the Thatcher years Dancing with Dogma, to reflect her often intractable views and approach. But even he praised her attention to detail and her mastery of the brief, even if he did not admire her footwork on the political dance floor. Although, almost unbelievably, she had moments of self-doubt, she reserved those for the private arena, and mostly to be shared with her devoted and doted-on Dennis. On public platforms, she always appeared sure-footed and brave with it. Politics takes no prisoners, Mr. Speaker, man or woman, and being Prime Minister is no easy sinecure. As an individual, I think she was braver than many men. She took on the vested interests, the dictators and the misogynists, and triumphed. She engineered the end of a Cold War and against all odds won a distant one. She curtailed the powers of the unelected unions and restored it to elected representatives. She removed the dead hand of the state from enterprise and helped people improve their lot and their lives through hard work and home ownership. And she established the United Kingdom's ground quite clearly and uniquely in a Europe that had its own grandiose ambitions to usurp our British sovereignty. Any one of those feats would have been enough to mark out an individual, but these and many more reflect a politician of substance whose like we may not see again in our lifetime. She will be missed in very many different ways by all who knew her, but especially by those who received her encouragement and kindness and protection. She has left an indelible impression on this country and abroad and on all future generations.
Diane Abbott.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very glad to have the opportunity to speak in this historic debate this afternoon. And it would be wrong not to pay tribute to Britain's first woman Prime Minister. And I would also say this. I entered Parliament in 1987 when Mrs. Thatcher was still Prime Minister in all her pomp and glory. And it's fair to say that she was a remarkable parliamentary phenomenon. She believed in Parliament as the cockpit of political debate in a way perhaps that is not fashionable today. And she was often the leading lady, whether you agreed with her or not, of some of Parliament's most momentous occasions. The House will not be surprised to hear that I did not agree with many of the things she stood for. But I don't rise in the chamber this afternoon to challenge her beliefs, but to remind the House very gently that even all these years after she stood down as leader of her party, there are millions of people up and down the country who felt themselves to be on the wrong side of the titanic battles that she fought. Whether it was people who felt the poll tax was imposed on them wrongly, whether it was young people who were caught up in the difficult relationships between police and community in our inner cities, whether it was people who were dismayed by her unwillingness to impose economic sanctions on South Africa and dismayed as well by her insistence on calling the ANC a terrorist organisation, or whether it was people that were caught up and I mean communities that were caught up in the miners' strike. There are still people living today who felt themselves on the wrong side of those titanic struggles. And this House should not give the appearance that their voice cannot be heard. There are many members here from mining communities, and they will have their say. But I will just quote from another Conservative leader, Harold Macmillan. And he spoke on the miners' strike when he made his very first speech in the House of Lords as Lord Stockton. And he said this: "It breaks my heart to see, and I cannot interfere, what is happening in our country today. This terrible strike by the best men in the world who beat the Kaisers and Hitler's armies and never gave in." And whatever the rights and wrongs of the titanic political struggles which she fought, and members on the other side have spoken about them at length, let us remember that for some of those communities, in their hearts, they never gave in, and they deserve to have a voice in the House this afternoon. I'm happy to pay tribute to her historic significance and her historic role, and I know that history is written by victors, but those of us that came of age in the Thatcher era know there was another side to the glories that members opposite have spoken about.
Sir Tony Baldry.
Mr. Speaker, I first met Margaret Thatcher when she was Secretary of State for Education, and I was a student at Sussex University, active in student politics, and from that I became Margaret Thatcher's personal aide and research assistant in the October 1974 general election. The Conservative Party were in opposition. Margaret was a member of the Shadow Cabinet and Shadow Minister for Housing and Planning. And in those days, members of Parliament didn't have numbers of research assistants, just a single House of Commons secretary. So the core campaign team in Finchley was small. Mrs. Thatcher's secretary, Alison Ward, now Lady Wakeham, her agent and myself. And what struck me first about working for Margaret Thatcher was her prodigious work ethic, indefatigable determination to analyse and understand any brief that she was given, and very considerable detail and attention to the last detail. And I think this was helped by the combination of training both as a research chemist and, as for a while, an extremely able junior at the tax bar. And working for Margaret producing research briefing for Margaret, you knew that you had to be able and ready to deal with any of these supplementary questions that she might ask, or at the very least know who could provide those detailed answers. I think the simple fact is that if one went to any meeting with Margaret, and I suspect that this was the case throughout the time that she was leader of the party and Prime Minister, she was always the best prepared person in the room, because she had invariably taken the time and effort to ensure that she was the best brief. And I remember that writing speeches for her in the October 1974 general election, there were two books that we used for primary source material. The first, as has already been mentioned, was F.A. Hayek's The Constitution of Liberty, and the other was a book written and published in the 1930s called A Time for Greatness. To my shame, I can't now remember the author's name, but I will recall that Margaret's reflection of these two books was along the lines of, if the state takes all in taxation, if the state spends all, we all become slaves of the state. Margaret Thatcher was also an incredibly kind, generally and particularly to those who worked for her. And of course, she revelled the Iron Lady sobriquet given to her by the Russians and others, which was a badge of respect for her steadfastness and determination. But there was also a much softer and more caring side to Margaret. And perhaps I can just give one example to which I think every member of the House could empathise. At one of my intake, Patrick Nichols was a very effective junior minister, but he'd had to resign from office following a road traffic offence. Not surprisingly, he was cross with himself, very frustrated, thought he'd let people down, etc. And one evening, Patrick had a telephone call from his whip, telling him to be in the division lobby at 5 to 10, shortly before the 10 o'clock vote. Patrick asked why. He was told simply to be there. Patrick arrived as instructed at 5 to 10, and shortly afterwards, Margaret Thatcher walked in, put her arm through his, and said, "How are things going, Patrick? How are you?" And then, as the division bell rang, and as the lobby filled with parliamentary colleagues, the Prime Minister slowly walked through the lobby, arm in arm with Patrick, chatting to him all the way, a very kind and clear gesture of support for someone who'd been a hard-working junior minister and who continued to be an extremely hard-working and loyal backbencher. Yeah. Margaret also had a great sense of humour. In the 1983 general election, another of our intake, Jeremy Hanley, won Richmond with a majority of just 74 votes. The day after the general election, Margaret, the Prime Minister, telephoned Jeremy to congratulate him on winning Richmond. The Conservative vote in the constituency had been about 21,000. The conversation went like this: "Jeremy, thank you very much, Prime Minister, for getting me the 74 votes that I needed." Prime Minister: "Jeremy, I got you the 21,000 votes. You just got the 74. Indeed, I often think there were two Margaret Thatchers. There was the real Margaret Thatcher, for those who knew and worked with her, and there was a caricature Margaret Thatcher of some press commentators, satirists, and political opponents. During the winter of the 1974-75, I gave some help to Erin Eve in the Conservative leadership campaign, and when Margaret became leader of the Conservative Party, I joined her private office for a while as the personal link between her and the Britain and Europe campaign, which was going on as a consequence of the EU referendum. So I had a good opportunity of seeing how Margaret worked in the early part of her leadership with parliamentary colleagues and advisers. Yes, Margaret Thatcher was certainly a person of robust views. She liked a good discussion, robust argument even. However, she was always willing to listen and heed the views of others. There were, I suspect, countless occasions when, having heard the arguments, having heard the advice of Willie Whitelaw, or on more personal matters heeded the good counsel of Dennis, Margaret would accept other people's contributions and advice, perhaps saying something like, "All right, we will do it your way, but you had better get it right." It is also a caricature to portray Margaret Thatcher as simply being anti-European. I had in my desk at home the originals of a number of speeches that Margaret Thatcher gave during the 1975 EU referendum campaign. Speeches clearly amended and corrected in her own very distinctive cursive handwriting. Speeches given in her constituency and elsewhere during the referendum campaign. Margaret campaigned wholeheartedly for a yes to Europe result in the 1975 referendum. And as those speeches demonstrate, she clearly believed in a strong Europe being a counterweight to the then Soviet Union and a strong partner to the United States. She clearly undoubtedly believed in a Europe of nation states and strongly believed in ensuring the speediest possible creation of the European single market, and was always extremely frustrated at other member states who sought to frustrate the further creation of a single market for their own particular nationalist interests. Ironically, I think this is where her frustration may have started with some of the workings of the European Union. Prior to the Single European Act in the mid-1980s, every EU member state had an effective veto on any issue of any importance. This meant that the EU Commission or the President of the Council of Ministers, wishing to get business through, had importantly to negotiate with and square any member states whom they thought would veto a particular proposal. That, of course, meant that any single member state could veto advances in the single market. It was therefore decided in the Single European Act to move to a system of majority qualified, majority weighted voting. And this, of course, overnight fundamentally changed the way in which the Council of Ministers and the Commission worked. Because, of course, all now the President and the Council of Ministers needed was to secure the support of sufficient member states to get a majority vote. So they would start with those member states whom they considered to be the most supportive of a proposal, and then worked on until they got a qualified majority, and if at the end there were some other member states on the other side of the argument, they weren't necessarily particularly concerned. But this change meant that whilst Margaret had succeeded in making the single market work much better, she was no longer able as easily to threaten to exercise a UK veto, and in time I think she found that very frustrating. I felt enormously privileged to have been appointed even as a junior minister in a government led by Margaret Thatcher. I was sent to the Department of Energy to help support John Wakeham with electricity privatisation. And with just the clarity of grip she'd had way back when I first worked for her in 1974, she explained clearly and succinctly exactly what she expected the department to achieve, not just in respect of electricity privatisation, but also the future of the coal industry and of nuclear power. Now, there are those who say that Margaret was divisive. To them, I would simply observe that Margaret Thatcher was a Democrat, and a Democrat who won 3 general elections in a row with increased majorities. I was elected in 1983 when Margaret secured a majority in the Commons of 144. I don't think any of us who were elected in June 1983 were in any doubt that we owed our election to Margaret Thatcher and the affection in which she was held by huge numbers of voters. I think this for me was best recalled in a single soundbite in Banbury Market. One of the television stations had come to do some vox pop on the election in Banbury. They went up to a chap who ran the fruit and veg stall. "What do you think about the general election?" they asked. "I don't know much about politics," said the guy, "but this I do know. Number 10, Maggie's Den." I think it was very cruel that Margaret Thatcher should have been so unwell for the last years of her life. And I think I first realised that something was not quite right a number of years ago when Margaret was speaking at a fundraising dinner for Somerville College. Mrs. Thatcher was making, Lady Thatcher she then was making a bravura speech, clearly setting out the thoughts and principles that had guided her throughout public life. But she was finding it difficult bringing the speech to a conclusion, and I suspect that those of us there who knew her must have suspected that all was not well. And so it sadly proved to be. And in passing, I think it is important to recall how proud Margaret was of having been made an honorary fellow of Somerville, the college which had really set her on the path to becoming the UK's first woman Prime Minister, and also how sad she was that she was never awarded an honorary degree by Oxford. It's all ancient history and in many ways water under the bridge, but as an Oxfordshire MP I always thought it reflected badly on the image and reputation of Oxford University that they had not felt able to recognise Margaret's unquestionable and outstanding achievements in politics and public life. Somerville established a number of fellowships in law and chemistry in honour of Margaret Thatcher, and I suspect that anyone was wanting to make a bequest in Margaret's memory, Somerville is one of the institutions that she would want to see flourish. Margaret is now at peace, and I am confident reunited with Dennis, who, notwithstanding the private eye caricature, was actually a man of good counsel, sound judgment, and a towering column of support and strength for Margaret, a thoroughly decent man. If I was just allowed one image or one memory of Margaret, it would be standing in the Winter Gardens in Blackpool in the 1980 Conservative Party conference, listening to Margaret's conference speech, where she said electrically, "I have only one thing to say. You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning."
Mr. David Winnick.
Mr. Speaker, I don't doubt for one moment that Lady Thatcher was kind and considerate in her dealings with those who worked for her. Indeed, I would be surprised if that was not the position. And no doubt some of her cabinet colleagues would have appreciated, at least in the later stages, the same consideration. However, it is my view that it would be wrong today, and indeed hypocritical, if the views we expressed at the time, strong views about the policies pursued by Mrs. Thatcher's government from 1979 to when she left office, were not mentioned today. It is right and understanding that those who support her have spoken and will continue, I'm sure, to speak in this debate. But the House is a place where opinion should be expressed freely, even if it's controversial, and I believe that those of us who so strongly disagree with the policies pursued by Lady Thatcher should make our views clear today. It's more political than personal. Of course, I regret, like everyone else, the passing of Lady Thatcher. I recognise that by becoming the first female Prime Minister in Britain, obviously she made history, and that cannot be disputed for one moment. But what was done under her premiership, the 11 years, or the way in which she always was more exact, the 11 and a half years in which she was at 10 Downing Street, the way in which those policies were carried out, in my view, and the view indeed of these benches at the time, were highly damaging, caused immense pain and suffering to ordinary people. And I believe, therefore, it's right that while tributes are being paid to the life of Lady Thatcher, we shouldn't forget what I've just mentioned, what happened at the time, and those of us who were here in the House of Commons when we used every opportunity of protesting cannot say that we were wrong in doing so, in protesting on behalf of our constituents who were the victims of those policies. It's not so much Lady Thatcher herself, but the way in which, once the election was won in 1979, it was decided to pursue policies which immediately, almost within a matter of a year or 2 years, caused the sort of outcome that I mentioned. In April-June 1979, unemployment, the rate was just over 5%. In March-May 1984, unemployment was well over 2 million, and the rate was just under 12%. Now those are the rates, that's the percentage. But what did it mean in human terms of men and women made redundant? And as we said at the time, so many of those people who worked all their lives since leaving school, when they were made redundant in their mid-50s, they knew and they discovered how difficult it would be ever to work again.
Exactly.
One has to understand what the human cost of those policies which have been mentioned today and which have been praised. In 1979, 14% of children lived in relative poverty. That was bad enough. Any children living in poverty is to be deplored. But in 1990-91, it was 31% who lived in such poverty. Are we to say, in effect, that those policies which have been praised today by the other side had no effect on the way in which the children lived in circumstances of poverty and deprivation, which I'm sure should be deplored, and certainly by this side? It could be argued, and I've heard this argument many times, Mr. Speaker, and certainly repeated today, that the policies that were undertaken were almost inevitable. That whoever formed the government of the day, it was almost impossible not to see the deindustrialisation, the closing of factories and foundries, of coal mines. But even if one accepts that argument, even if one accepts that some of it was inevitable, what was so unfortunate was what I can only describe as the indifference and at times almost the brutal contempt for those who lost their jobs. Instead of support, instead of understanding of what it meant to those, so many who were to lose their jobs. Instead of understanding what it meant to the people involved, it almost seemed like the government of the day blamed the people who were made redundant, as if it was their fault.
Exactly.
As if somehow, if only they went on a bike, as Lord Tebbit said, like his dad apparently did, they would find jobs. This is what I meant by an indifference, a brutal contempt for people who, no fault of their own, found themselves in circumstances which none of us would like to see. Now, the honourable gentleman wanted to intervene, but apparently...
Thank you very much. The honourable gentleman giving way. I noticed at the time he wouldn't give way to me, but I was made redundant at the time he said I set up my own business due to Thatcherism, and I made a success, and here I am now preaching it forward.
And doesn't it prove the point that I make? Doesn't it prove so much that so many people were not in a position to do what the honourable gentleman, what he said very much expresses Thatcherism. I was made redundant, he says, I found another job, here I am today. What about all the others who were not in a position to do so? What about all the others I've mentioned in their 50s who were not able ever to work again because as they grew older, employers said they were too near the retirement age? My point couldn't be better illustrated by the honourable gentleman, and I thank him for so doing. In the Black Country and in the West Midlands, we were devastated by the two major recessions which occurred during the 1980s. My honourable friend for Hackney rightly referred to the terrible hardship which occurred in the mining community, and many of us believe the miners were treated with utter contempt. However much it could be said that Arthur Scargill played into our hands, but the manner in which the miners were treated are not likely to be forgotten by the communities involved. And it's right and proper, I would argue, that this should be said today when tributes are being paid to the former Prime Minister. Let me also just say this. Mention was made by the Prime Minister and others that Lady Thatcher had a commitment to parliamentary democracy. I don't doubt that for one moment. She was long a member, 32 years, of this House. She then went to the House of Lords, where she played an active role. It could be said that a certain Mr. Gorbachev had a role to play in what happened in Eastern Europe and the manner in which he made it perfectly clear, particularly to the East Germans, that the Russians would no longer in any circumstances bolster up regimes which were totally discredited. But to the extent that Lady Thatcher made a contribution, I don't want to dispute that in any way over Eastern Europe. But it's unfortunate, is it not, but she was so totally unsympathetic to the fight in South Africa, apartheid, to describe the African National Congress as a terrorist organisation, to describe Nelson Mandela as a terrorist. That cannot be justified under any circumstances. And I remember, Mr. Speaker, when Nelson Mandela as president came here as a very distinguished visitor. He was at Westminster Hall. We paid tribute to him and we listened very keenly to what President Mandela said. And I couldn't but notice, in the front row listening to him was Lady Thatcher. And I would hope that by then she would have realised she was wrong in the line which she took over apartheid. And of course, if we're for freedom, not only in Europe, we should be concerned with freedom, certainly in South Africa, but in Latin America. And I was never a fan of Pinochet, a professional mass murderer. Lady Thatcher was a decisive figure. A divisive figure, and she would not for one moment argue otherwise. I think one thing we could agree in this House, consensus was not her favourite word. And I would simply say this: the Prime Minister mentioned former Prime Ministers. In my view, the two Prime Ministers who made the greatest impression since 1945 was Clement Attlee. The tremendous changes which, in my view, and the view of these benches obviously, made Britain a far more civilised country with National Health Service, National Insurance and the like. The other figure is one which we're paying tribute today, Lady Thatcher. She believed that so much of what occurred post-1945 was wrong and should be undermined. My view remains that what the Attlee government set out to do was absolutely right. And what she set out to do, to undermine much of the changes brought about in this country immediately after the Second World War, was wrong. And I know which side I'm on.
Mr. John Whittingdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The House of Commons today rightly pays tribute to a great Prime Minister and a great parliamentarian. We, who sit as Conservative members of Parliament on this side, salute someone who was one of our most successful and influential leaders of our party. And those of us who were privileged enough to know her and to work for her remember an inspiring figure, but also a warm and compassionate person who inspired tremendous loyalty amongst her staff. I was 15 when she became leader of my party, and like so many of my generation and those that followed, I was influenced in my politically formative years by her exposition of ideas and her beliefs, which were developed with Keith Joseph out of the Centre for Policy Studies. And it was that clear articulation of an ideological philosophy that attracted me to want to become involved in Conservative politics. 3 years later, I was lucky enough to meet her for the first time when I began to work for the Conservative Party. I was in her office on the day that Erin Neve was killed, and I was also working for her in Downing Street some years later on the day that Ian Gow was assassinated. Two terrible blows to her personally. She was a controversial and sometimes divisive figure. It was inevitable, given the scale of the challenges that she and her government faced. She had to make what were difficult and unpopular decisions. But it was her conviction and her strength of purpose which enabled her to achieve what she did, often in the face of enormous opposition. It was opposition that she confronted right from the start of her career. I think the Leader of the Opposition referred to her time at Oxford. She became active in the Oxford University Conservative Association, and indeed president of it, because women were not allowed to participate in the Oxford Union. She then, once she became leader of her party, confronted huge opposition within our own ranks. There were many people who resented her background, coming from a middle-class family in Grantham. They resented her sex, and they also resented her ideological certainty. All these things were certainly novel for the Conservative Party at that time. Her strength of purpose allowed her to confront our country's enemies. We have referred to General Galtieri and to the invasion of the Falkland Islands. Her role in persuading George Bush that she must confront Saddam Hussein when he invaded and occupied Kuwait, and also her role with Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev in bringing about the end of communism. But she was also a pragmatist and a realist. She was responsible for the Lancaster House Agreement, which ended white rule in Rhodesia and ushered in black majority government there. She negotiated the handback of Hong Kong to the Chinese, and as we have heard, she signed the Anglo-Irish Agreement. I first worked for her directly during the two general election campaigns of 1983 and 1987, when I accompanied her on her tour of the country. It was my first experience of her punishing workload, her extraordinary attention to detail, and her occasionally somewhat unreasonable demands. But I also saw at first hand her instinctive feel for what the aspirations and the beliefs of the people in Britain were, and it was her identity with those people that allowed her to articulate so clearly what they wanted. And actually, it was that then delivered in those two general elections successively majorities for the Conservative Party of 144 and 102. Some of us might think those were the days. In 1988, she asked me to become her political secretary in Downing Street. I saw then, at first hand, her huge respect for Parliament itself. She occupied the position of Prime Minister, but she never forgot that she was also the Member of Parliament for Finchley, and she believed that it was her duty to come here not just to speak, but to vote as well in the division lobbies on their behalf. I used to help her with preparation for Prime Minister's questions. In those days it lasted just 15 minutes and took place twice a week. She used to spend something like 6 or 7 hours preparing for that 15-minute session. We used to go through the briefs from every government department across Whitehall, where they set out the exposition of the government's policy and the line to take. Sometimes she didn't think it was very good. I would be sent to ring up the private secretary of the minister in the department to tell him that the Prime Minister didn't like this particular line to take. Occasionally, she strode across the study and took the phone from my hands and told the private secretary herself that not only did she not like the line to take, occasionally she didn't even like the policy either. She had a remarkable ability every now and again to somehow distance herself from the policies of the government, which she also was the leader of. There are one or two misconceptions which I would just like to set right. I listened carefully to the Honourable Gentleman for Walsall North. But it is the case that whilst Margaret Thatcher was opposed to economic sanctions against South Africa, she was fiercely opposed to apartheid as well. And she argued with the South African government that they should release Nelson Mandela from prison. And that is something which was recognised, if not by the Honourable Gentleman, then by Nelson Mandela himself. I would also say to the leader of the Liberal Democrats, who I'm sorry is no longer here, yes, she did say there is no such thing as society. But she went on to say what there is that there are families and there are communities. And she set out the fact that if individuals see people who are less well off or in need, they bear a personal and moral responsibility, not just to let society, some amorphous body, take responsibility, but for them themselves to act. That is why it is such an appalling twisting of her message that people now claim she said there is no such thing as society. I also saw at first hand her immense personal kindness and her compassion. As has been said, it was often to the most junior members of her staff. The famous occasion when the waitress spilt the soup on Geoffrey Howe. It wasn't Geoffrey Howe she worried about, it was the waitress. She was always insistent that she could never be late, particularly for funerals. Sadly, I used to accompany her occasionally to funerals, and we used to sit in lay-bys for 15 or 20 minutes because we'd set off so early just in case there would be heavy traffic, because she could not possibly allow herself to be late. There are members on this side of the House, but there are also members on the other side of the House who I know received personal handwritten letters from her when they experienced a tragedy in their own private lives or with their families. She had an enormous compassion. If ever she found somebody was alone at Christmas, she would always say they should come and spend it with checkers with her. Indeed, famously, Ronnie Miller, the playwright, told me that he used to spend many months trying to think of excuses why he was going to be busy, because the idea of being with Margaret Thatcher at Christmas might not have been the most relaxing way to spend it. After she stood down as Prime Minister, she on several occasions came to support me in Essex. Essex has always been Thatcher country, and I was pleased to see that when she came to Malden, the constituency I represent, at the election in which I first stood as candidate after she had stood down as Prime Minister, the pavements had crowds 4 or 5 deep who turned out to see her. Not all of them actually were supporters of her, or probably even supporters of mine, but they wanted to be there because they recognised that she played such a hugely important role in their lives and in the life of their country. And even now today, when I occasionally meet people from different countries, other parliamentarians, sometimes even leaders, if I say to them that I served as Margaret Thatcher's political secretary, it is that which alights their interest, and in many ways it is that of which I am most proud. It was a privilege to know her, an even greater privilege to have worked for someone who was one of the greatest Prime Ministers this country has ever had.
Linda Jackson.
Speaker, it's hardly a surprise that Baroness Thatcher was careless over soup being poured over Lord Howe when she was apparently perfectly prepared to send him out to the wicket with a broken bat. Mr. Speaker, when I made my maiden speech, all in this chamber, a little over 2 decades ago, Margaret Thatcher had been elevated to the other place. But Thatcherism was still wreaking, as it had wreaked for the previous decade, the most heinous social, economic and spiritual damage upon this country, upon my constituency and my constituents. Our local hospitals were running on empty. Patients were staying on trolleys in corridors. I tremble to think what the death rate for pensioners would have been this winter if that version of Thatcherism had been fully up and running this year. Our schools, parents, teachers, governors, even pupils seem to spend an inordinate amount of time fundraising in order to be able to provide basic materials such as paper and pencils. The plaster on our classroom walls were kept in place by pupils' artwork and miles of sellotape. Our school libraries were dominated by empty shelves, very few books, and those books that were there, again, were being held together by the ubiquitous sellotape and offcuts from teachers' wallpaper used to bind those volumes so that they could at least hang together. But by far, the most dramatic and heinous demonstration of Thatcherism was certainly not only in London, but across the whole country in metropolitan areas, where every single shop doorway, every single night, became the bedroom, the living room, the bathroom for the homeless. They grew in their thousands. And many of those homeless people had been thrown out onto the streets from the closure of the long-term mental hospitals. We were told it was called care in the community. What in effect it was no care at all. in the community. I was interested to hear about Baroness Thatcher's willingness to invite those who had nowhere to go for Christmas. It's a pity she didn't start building more and more social houses after she entered into the right to buy. So perhaps there would have been fewer homeless people than there were. As a friend of mine said, during her era, London became a city Hogarth would have recognised, and indeed he would. But the basis to Thatcherism, and this is where I come to the spiritual part of what I regard as a desperately wrong track that that Thatcherism took this country into, is that we were told that everything I had been taught to regard as a vice, and I still regard them as vices, under Thatcherism was in fact a virtue. Greed, selfishness, no care for the weaker, sharp elbows, sharp knees, they were the way forward. We heard much over and will continue to hear over the next week of the barriers that were broken down by Thatcherism, the establishment that was destroyed.
I can't take it.
What we actually saw, the word that has been circling around with stars around it, is that she created an aspirational society. It aspired for things. As indeed one of the former prime ministers, who himself had been elevated to the House of Lords, spoke about selling off the family silver, and people knowing under those years the price of everything and the value of nothing. What concerns me is that I am beginning to see possibly the re-emergence of that total traducing of what I regard as being the basis spiritual nature of this country, where we do care about society, where we do believe in communities, where we do not leave people to walk by on the other side. That isn't happening now. And if we go back to the heyday of that era, I think we will see replicated yet again the extraordinary human damage that we as a nation have suffered from, the talent that has been totally wasted because of the inability to genuinely see the individual value of every single human being. My honourable friend from Hackney referred to the fact that although she had differed with Lady Thatcher in her policies, she felt duty-bound to come to pay tribute to the first woman Prime Minister this country had produced. I am a generation who was raised by women. The men had all gone to war to defend our freedoms. They didn't just run a government, they ran a country. And the women that I knew, who raised me and millions of people like me, who ran our factories and our businesses, put out the fires when the bombs dropped, they would not have recognised their definition of womanliness as being incorporated an iconic model of Margaret Thatcher, to pay tribute to the first Prime Minister deputed by female gender. Okay, but a woman not on my terms.
Point of order, Sir Tony Baldry.
Mr. Speaker, the conventions of the House in respect of those occasions, rare occasions, on which the House chooses to make tributes to a person who has been deceased, are well established. This is not and has never been a general debate on the memory of the person who has been deceased, but an opportunity for tributes, not an opportunity for honourable members to denigrate the memory of the person who has been deceased.
Resume his seat. I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for his, and I use the term advisedly, attempted point of order. Let me be explicit for the benefit both of the honourable gentleman and of the House. all honourable and right honourable members take responsibility for what they say in this place. The responsibility of the chair is to ensure that nothing unparliamentary occurs. Let me assure the honourable gentleman, for the avoidance of doubt, nothing unparliamentary has occurred. We are debating a motion that says that this House has considered the matter of tributes to the Baroness Thatcher. That is what we are doing, and nothing has got in the way of that. Mr. Graham Brady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for your advice. We've had some warm and dignified tributes from both sides of the House, led admirably by the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition. I hope that we can now return to tributes in that spirit. Briefly, I want to pay tribute in three different ways. As chairman of the 1922 committee, I want to pay tribute on behalf of Conservative backbenchers present and past, although I note from the number of colleagues who are standing to make their own contributions that they may well speak for themselves in due course. Like many others, I also want to pay a personal tribute, and especially as a Northern Conservative MP, now representing the constituency in which I grew up in the 1980s, I want to pay tribute in that regard, and perhaps to answer and respond to the points that were made by the Right Honourable Gentleman for Oldham West and Royston earlier in this debate. On behalf of the 1922 committee, I want to pay tribute to a leader and Prime Minister who achieved so much. 3 stunning election victories, turning around a moribund economy, ending decades of decline. From the sick man of Europe, only good at making jokes about ourselves, that I remember as a boy, she restored our national pride. I want to pay tribute to Margaret Thatcher for the inspirational leadership she gave to the Conservative Party, for inspiring Conservative supporters around the country, but most of all, for inspiring millions of people who had never before realised they were Conservatives. Lady Thatcher's strength, conviction, patriotism and clarity won her the respect of friends and fair-minded critics alike. Perhaps most remarkable was not just her popularity in this country, but also the popularity overseas, and the lasting legacy of freedom, democracy and prosperity that we've heard about from a number of colleagues, that she leaves as a leader who helped to win the Cold War and who inspired the people of Eastern Europe to fight for their own freedom. Her legacy in our own country and beyond will always be remembered with pride by this party. As for so many members of my age, my tribute is also intensely personal. Growing up under Margaret Thatcher's governments, it was impossible to be agnostic about politics. Her message was one of opportunity. Whatever your background, you could progress by merit and hard work. Had I not taken that message to heart, I, like so many others on these benches, and perhaps from a different perspective, quite a few on the other side of the House, would not be here in Parliament today. The last part of my brief tribute to Lady Thatcher, Mr. Speaker, is, as I say, that of a Northern Member of Parliament. And it is to address a myth that is in danger of taking hold. And my honourable friend from Malden addressed some others that have been spread recently. Whilst it is, of course, true that the restructuring of our economy in the early 1980s hit parts of the North hard, because there was a concentration of heavy industry and mining that had become uncompetitive and uneconomic. Many metropolitan journalists fall into the peddling of an easy fallacy, suggesting that the North was hostile uniformly to the message of Lady Thatcher. We were not. Many Labour members sitting opposite will recall the seats that they now represent, returning Conservative members who supported Margaret Thatcher's strong defence, modernisation of the economy, determination to extend opportunity, the spreading of wealth and home ownership to their constituents. Many of those seats across the North only returned Labour members after Tony Blair embraced the free market, low tax message of Margaret Thatcher. Mr. Speaker, we are here to remember a truly remarkable lady who has influenced all our lives, who transformed our country and helped bring freedom to others, but most of all was unwavering in doing what she believed to be right. We should honour her memory.
Mr. Frank Field.
Mr. Speaker, David Shepherd was a left-wing Bishop of Liverpool, much admired and also loved. And in one of his volumes of autobiography, he recalls his meetings with Mrs. Thatcher, or rather the lead-up to the meetings with Mrs. Thatcher. He recalled the state that he would be in, the feeling of illness, of sickness, as the dread hour approached. On one occasion, I asked her with a year to go before she would make the appointment for a new archbishop, if David Shepherd was on the list of the two names that came to her from the Royal Commission, would she appoint him? Her reply was immediate: yes, of course. Slightly staggered by that response, and I said, why? And she said, he always tells me to my face what he thinks, and we always have a good argument. It seemed therefore proper that in these tributes that we pay to this extraordinary person, that we follow her example, that we shouldn't be frightened of argument, or even, let's say, of division. Indeed, we mock her if that is so. The Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition made powerful speeches about the way she has shaped the world in which all of us live. I would just extend that in two ways. The world in which all of us live, all of our constituents, has been shaped by Clement Attlee and Margaret Thatcher. And of course the danger for both of those people who brought an ideology into politics and saw it being operated was that some of their supporters might think just preaching the ideology was enough rather than responding to what the real world was teaching them. The member for Woking talked about the sale of council houses, and as with all of us in this debate, we sometimes give a slant to history, don't we? There were people on this side who also wanted to sell council houses, and the record shows that both the Wilson and the Callaghan governments looked at the idea. The problem was that the civil servants told them that it wasn't actually doable. So one of the lessons about Mrs. Thatcher isn't it, that you don't necessarily take the advice of the civil servants if you actually want to see radical politics. But she, Mr. Speaker, was not uncritical of her own record. On one occasion I asked her, Mrs. T, what was your greatest disappointment in government? And again, as though she thought long and hard beforehand about it, said, I cut taxes and I thought we would get a giving society, and we haven't. So here was somebody who thought we would, by low taxation, see that extraordinary culture in America of people making fortunes and wanting, perhaps publicly, to declare what they were doing with it. That hadn't taken root here. So I think we should look critically at her record. It's wrong of us, of course, to assume what Mrs. T would be saying listening to this debate, but I think she'd want to get on to what the differences were and how do we take the debate forward. And I just want to mention three areas where we are still grappling with her legacy, of which neither front bench yet has managed to come to terms. The first is the great question of riches. She wasn't satisfied with what the results were of her government. Should we be? That's the first issue. The second is, despite all the gains that the market economy gave to this country, there are clearly some areas, and I represent part of my constituency is like this, where the powers of the market are unable to reach. We've not come up with policies which try and move these areas back to full employment. How do we raise the demand in those areas, but not generally? And how do we make sure that the supply side, which most of us now are committed to, also can take effect through our schools? And then there is, of course, the third big area, which she thought she'd solved, but it appears in our country in a different guise. We've mentioned, quite properly even on this side, that one of her great struggles was to bring the trade unions within the law that this House decided would be the law, not the law which the trade unions thought that they would abide by. I've been perplexed by some of the coverage of Mrs. Thatcher's stewardship in the paper in the last few days, saying that the country was ungovernable. It was governable, all right, but it wasn't governable from here or the government that was elected by the people. So what would Mrs. Thatcher say when we're now in a global economy, part of which she was so responsible for creating, when we have great world companies picking and choosing whether they pay taxes or not, whether in fact giving a donation to the Treasury is actually an adequate performance of their duties. I would be very surprised if she did not see that challenge to our authority as one with which we need to grapple. So all three is the current part of the current agenda for our politics, and it's part of her legacy. And I wonder whether she wouldn't be tackling it in a more resolute way than we are currently. I'd like to end, if I may, Mr. Speaker, with two comments about her, because we've talked about her power, her force, her personality, but she was also brilliant on detail, and detail was part of her power in Whitehall. I'd been to see her on behalf of a defence order for Camel Lairds. Indeed, my relationship was formed with her by the shop stewards, the second meeting I had in Birkenhead as MP, when they said, we've cut out all this old stuff, we want a cross-party group, we want you to lead it, we want all the parties in the Wirral lobbying for orders. That was the beginning of the friendship that I had with her. And this meeting took place on the day that she came back from meeting President Bush, #1, and deciding on the war, the first Gulf War. She had every reason to cancel it, but the meeting took place in her study. I'd never seen her in this state before. She was marching around the study saying, no idea, I put backbone into him, no idea what a strike. I was saying, Prime Minister, would you come and sit next to me? I've got some things I'd like to talk to you about. And anyway, she went on about putting backbone into the American president to fight this great war. Finally, she took pity on me and came, said, what do you want? And I made the plea for the defence order. And she said, fine. Anything else? I said, no. Immediately she got up and said, you've no idea the victory I've had today for this. I was really rather excited being this very, very small footnote in history. And of course, courtesy was that whichever one of the Wirral MPs was lobbying, we'd tell the other MPs. In the excitement, I'd forgotten to tell the other Wirral MPs, and 36 hours later, I saw David Hunt walking down the corridor, and I thought, I haven't told him what the results are. I began to apologise, and he said, no need to apologise, Frank. The relevant secretaries of state have had a prime ministerial minute, and it's been copied to their permanent secretaries. Now, here was somebody making history, for right or wrong, I think rightly, who was extraordinarily wound up by the events which she had managed to cast. She had nobody with her, it was no staff with her, but before she went to bed that night, she actually made that minute to implement what she'd agreed with. And as a lobbyist, lobbying the Prime Minister, she was wonderful. You knew within seconds whether she was going to do it or whether it was a balmy idea. There was actually no point discussing it further. One last point. Towards her end, as Prime Minister, she was captured by a court on that side, who made it difficult not only for many of you as backbenchers to see her, but certainly somebody like me. And I wrote to the court and said that if they continued to block my chance of talking to her and lobbying her, I would kidnap her, tell her what you were doing to her, but also be able to lobby her. And I got a note back late in the debate saying the Prime Minister will see you at 10 o'clock. And it's a good lesson to the Prime Minister and Leader of the Opposition. She had a hugely impressive voting record. And she was, in my experience, one of the last out of the lobbies. She was there for people to talk to, not in there and out and away, doing what they thought would be more important business. And as she passed by, I said to her, "Prime Minister, shall I follow you?" And she said, "People do." I have never worked out, not having a mirror in front of her, whether she was smiling at that occasion or not. I hope it was. But the following her is a challenge to us. Do we see her record as though it was brought down Mount Sinai in tablets of stone, never to be changed? Or would she have recognised, as I've hinted at with a few conversations I had specifically on this, that there is now a new agenda, and whatever principles you have, you actually need to apply those principles to that new agenda. And I thought the leader of the opposition and the Prime Minister were so right. To her, what mattered was ideas, and could you defend your corner? I miss her passing.
Mrs. Eleanor Ladd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Margaret Thatcher changed the world for women. For women across the world, for women in Britain, for women in politics, in Parliament. And I, Mr. Speaker, cannot stand by and watch commentators say that Margaret Thatcher did nothing for women, when I know, as many of my honourable friends in the House and around the country know, just how much of a difference her very being has made to women. In the first place, because of her great belief in freedom and the individual, and because her governments brought freedom and choice to people who had never had it before, a huge difference was made to millions and millions of women throughout Britain during Margaret Thatcher's years as Prime Minister. Now, we've had different examples today of what happened to people's individual lives in the 1980s, but overall there is no doubt whatsoever that bringing freedom and choice and opportunity, because those were her watchwords, freedom and choice and opportunity, transformed young women of the 1980s into women of the 90s and this century who are willing to take on the world. And as for women in politics and Parliament, Margaret Thatcher gave us encouragement and advice. I'm fed up hearing the media channels say that she didn't want women around and there was only one woman in her cabinet while she was Prime Minister. That wasn't her fault. There weren't enough women here on these benches with the experience and the seniority to go into her cabinet. She encouraged women so that at the end of her premiership, and then when John Major became Prime Minister, there were plenty of women to go into the cabinet. They would not have been there had they not had the encouragement and the backing of Margaret Thatcher when she was Prime Minister. And what we know on this side of the House is also what she has done in latter years. It's only just over a year ago, while she had supposedly withdrawn from public life, but while many of us knew that she was still extremely active in supporting what we were doing, that she came to not one but 2 or 3 events that I can think of which were involved in not just raising money to help women come into Parliament, but also by her very presence in a room of aspiring people, and by a mere handshake from Margaret Thatcher, a young woman would leave an event saying, "I can do this," whereas previously she had thought that she couldn't. Such was the power and the personality of this great lady. And I can forgive female colleagues on the other side of the House for thinking that Margaret Thatcher didn't encourage women because, of course, it goes without saying that she preferred to see Conservatives elected rather than Labour or Liberal female members of Parliament. But in her encouragement and in her giving of advice, she was really, on a personal level, much more like a mother than like a Prime Minister. She would hold your hand and say, well, my dear, what are you doing about this? Or what is going to happen about that? She gave true encouragement and really, really gave people confidence. And actually, I'm quite wrong to stand here and say that she did that for women. She did it for everyone who had the slightest little bit of Conservative blood in their body. And she would make the very best of that and help them to realise just how much they could achieve.
Right.
And I don't mean just in politics, because of course that was what she did for people throughout the country. People who thought that they didn't have the aspiration and didn't have the opportunity, because before Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister, they didn't have the opportunity and they were told that they should not and could not aspire. She gave everybody confidence that they could make the very best of themselves. And she certainly did it for my generation of women in the Conservative Party. She certainly gave me personal advice, which I have always valued and tried to live up to, not necessarily with the greatest results that she might have hoped for. But she understood the difficulty that women have in public life because they're trying to balance their duties to their families, to their constituency, to Parliament, and to their general duties. She understood that. She made allowances for it. And again, the way she dealt with these matters was to give encouragement. Of course, it never occurred to her that women might need special pleading. Of course she didn't want women-only shortlists, because it simply never occurred to her that her female status was any hindrance to her at all, and indeed that's because it wasn't. Because the other great thing about Margaret Thatcher that no one has as yet mentioned is that in all that she did in public life, in all the many hours that she spent at that dispatch box, indeed at that dispatch box in Downing Street and representing our country around the world, she was always, on every occasion, immaculate and elegant. Here was a lady who was tougher than any man, but she never lost her femininity. Because of Margaret Thatcher.
Keep going.
Because of.
I don't know why members think the Honourable Lady had finished. She'd finished that paragraph. This is Eleanor Lang.
Quite right.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was pausing for effect, Mr. Speaker. I will conclude, Mr. Speaker. Because of Margaret Thatcher, because of her brilliance, her resolve, her determination, her courage, her example, no woman can ever be told that she cannot rise to any challenge. Margaret Thatcher made the world a better place.
Mr. Kevin Barron.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I first of all say I would like to offer my condolences to Lady Thatcher's family, in particular her children and grandchildren as well. And I also want to recognise, and it's been said by both of the front bench speeches as well, that this is not the only woman Prime Minister this country's had, but she rose to the top of a major political party at a time when they were still and are still dominated by men. I think the Prime Minister said she broke through a big glass ceiling. We should recognise that fact as well. And I would also like to add my thoughts to what the member for Belfast South said. Today is the 15th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, and the House should acknowledge that it was her initiative in the 1980s that was the start of the peace process, which I'm sure that many people have good reason to thank her for today as well. Lady Thatcher was a radical politician and will always remain a controversial figure. She would have expected that her conviction politics would still cause controversy, even at a time like this. However, I have to say that many of her domestic policies caused great concern and harm to many people and communities. I entered this House in 1983, 9 months before the start of the miners' strike. Coming from a mining background and representing a mining constituency, my overriding memory of the 12-month strike was not the violence that took place. We've seen on our television screens. Indeed, I condemned the violence at the time it was happening. It was that during that strike, the poverty and hardship that miners and their families went through for the best part of 12 months. We know the cause of that strike was the proposed pit closure programme and the consequent effect, particularly on male unemployment, which had always been traditionally high in coal mining communities. I am not saying that the government of the day was wholly to blame for the strike and its consequences, but I do believe that they had a responsibility to bring the dispute to an earlier end, something that they did not do. On Saturday, I attended a march commemorating the closure of Maltby Colliery. It was a coal mine that I worked at as a young man. It was the 6th and last coal mine to close in the Rother Valley constituency, and I have to say that the bitterness that stems from the 84-85 strike is there amongst people even all these years later. And I felt that whilst tribute will and can be paid to Margaret Thatcher, there are other voices that ought to be heard in this country as well.
Mr. Christopher Chope.
Mr. Speaker, it was on Monday when I was out in Eastern Europe monitoring elections that I heard the sad news about Margaret's death. And it was very appropriate, in a sense, to be out in Eastern Europe witnessing democracy in action, which wouldn't have been possible but, in my view, the work that Margaret Thatcher did in destroying communism and opening up Eastern Europe to proper democracy. We've had some brilliant tributes today, led by my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, and I think he, in his remarks, encapsulated so many of the values which we hold dear when we remember Margaret Thatcher. But so also did the Leader of the Opposition, and I was particularly grateful to him for reminding us of the difference between consensus and conviction. And of course that is the problem that so many of us on this side have with the coalition, that it muddles up consensus and conviction, and those of us who are conviction politicians find it incredibly frustrating. But the theme I would like to pursue very briefly is the theme of compassion, to which my honourable friend the member for Malden spoke so eloquently. Because Margaret Thatcher was a passionate Conservative, but she was also a compassionate Conservative. And when I first met her in 1976, I think I was then the chairman of the Putney Conservatives, and she visited an old people's day centre in Putney. And I then saw her in action. She spoke to every single person who was in that day centre sitting room, and those who were in a position where they couldn't really speak to her easily, she actually knelt down. As leader of the Conservative Party, she knelt down in order to be able to converse meaningfully with these individuals who were sitting in this old people's day centre. That, for me, was a demonstration of her humility and her compassion. And people have already spoken of the way in which she would write letters to colleagues who'd been bereaved and so on. And there was one occasion a few years later when my wife was in hospital, and I think, Mr. Speaker, that the flowers from Margaret Thatcher arrived before my own, which was rather embarrassing. But that was the extent. That was the extent to which she was on the ball in her generosity and kindness to colleagues, not just colleagues, but also to their wives. And can I say that I agreed with Margaret Thatcher on almost everything. The only thing with which I disagreed with her fundamentally big issue, and that was her decision not to stand in the second ballot in 1990. Because if she had stood, I think she would have won, and I think the course of history would have been changed. And I'm sad that those of us who went into her study that evening, Mr. Speaker, in order to try and persuade her to change her mind, that we were unsuccessful. But after that, it was typical again of her that she sent special notes to all those of us who had tried to persuade her to stay on. But it was a humiliating experience for this fantastic Prime Minister, and having been in that study and seen the condition in which she was, I wouldn't wish it on anybody. Somebody who had served their country and with such distinction, who had been a global leader in bringing freedom to so much in Eastern Europe, she was in a position where she had been humiliated by some of the people she thought were her friends and colleagues. And I thought, frankly, and still think, it was intolerable, and may that sort of thing never happen again. In 1997, Margaret came and supported my election campaign in Christchurch, where we were trying to overturn a Liberal Democrat majority of something like 16,000, which they had won in the 1993 by-election. And this was her first outing during the campaign. And, Mr. Speaker, she was confronted by the press because one of our colleagues who was standing in Tottenham, he suddenly hit the headlines, and Margaret demonstrated her ability to deal with the press with a phrase, or in this case a very short sentence, which couldn't really result in any follow-up, because she was asked about Neil Hamilton, and she said, "Nobody is perfect." And so she, in those 3 words, she closed down any other conversation, because she wasn't passing judgment upon his particular case, but she was saying nobody is perfect, and obviously that applies to all of us. So that was an example of how she was able to deal with the press and choose words which were so effective. And then later, on that same visit, we went to on a private visit to a primary school in Christchurch. And there she demonstrated some other attributes, the ability to listen and the ability to really speak her mind. She was talking to a 9-year-old, and she was saying to this 9-year-old, "And what do you want to do when you grow up?" And he said, "I want to be a musician." And she paused and she stared with her wonderful eyes at this young man, and said, "And what else do you want to be?" and Mr. Speaker, that I think demonstrated that she did nothing for effect. When she asked somebody a question, she was willing to listen to the answer and make a comment, and she was able to give that person the benefit of her views, whether they liked it or not. And I hope that that individual is now a successful musician. But if he is not, then I hope he has a backup, which is what she was really saying that he ought to have. So, Mr. Speaker, it's a fantastic opportunity and privilege today to be able to pay tribute to the greatest Prime Minister, in my view, of all time. And I think that we are gathered together, and it's sometimes sometimes one sits in this chamber and it takes a long time before you get called, but today it has been a privilege to be able to listen to every contribution. And I think that if this debate goes on till 10 o'clock, as I hope it will, that in some way will be a compensation for the loss of this great lady.
Gisela Stewart.
Mr. Speaker, Nancy Astor, when she left the House of Commons, said, I will miss the House, but the House won't miss me. I think in terms of Baroness Thatcher, she will be someone who this House and the other House will miss probably for longer than many another woman who has served in this place. And I do want to say something about Margaret Thatcher and the representation of women. And I say so as an MP who represents a constituency which has been represented by women for longer than any other constituency in the country. Birmingham Edgbaston's been represented since 1953 by a woman MP. It was first Dame Edith Pitt, who the then Conservative and Unionist Party had to nominate as the candidate because the local association rebelled against the original nomination on the basis that we've got a perfectly good candidate, albeit a woman, and they caved in. When Dame Jill Knight in 1966 was selected, the Conservative Association said, we've already tried a woman, so we have a man now. And she said, I'll accept that argument, but only if it works both ways. And of course it didn't. And Margaret Thatcher did break through that glass ceiling, as the Prime Minister said. She kicked the doors open. She kicked doors open also for Labour women in a way which they probably didn't entirely appreciate, because the trade unions had an enormously powerful role in candidate selections. And when the trade unions were forced to be more open to women, and when it came to one member, one vote and a lot of other things, whilst Margaret Thatcher would not have thought of it that way, it did benefit us. What I think she did not realise is that the problem was more systemic. Because, quite frankly, despite what the Honourable Epping Forrest said, in 1997 we went into an election when there were more men called John in the House of Commons than there were women MPs. And when in May 1997 121 women MPs came in here, that was more women MPs in one intake than in the entire history of Parliament. But I don't think we are right to lay the blame for this at the door of Margaret Thatcher. It was a reflection of the time. I think if she had not been the way she was, she would have not got to the position she was in. But I did slightly reflect on why is she still so controversial. A few years ago, the House magazine gave Dennis Healy the Life Achievement Award, and it was Geoffrey Howe who gave him the award. So there were two old adversaries in friendship meeting at the Speaker's house. And Dennis Healy said, when you get to my age, there aren't enemies anymore, they're just people who are still alive with you. Somehow, that is not the way I think Margaret Thatcher would have seen it. She was fighting to the very end. And I think it was a sign of the time that she had to fight to the very end. Because the whole generations have forgotten what 1979 was like. I came from Germany in the 70s. And one of the things I just want to very briefly explore with the House is because Margaret Thatcher would not want us to not learn any lessons from the battles she'd fought, some lost, some won, and ones which go on. And that was in relation to the role of the market. It was very interesting, this reference that Margaret Thatcher thought that the Road to Serfdom, Hayek's book, should be made compulsory reading. It may surprise many members on this opposite side, and probably even more on my own side, that I too agree that I think Hayek's Road to Serfdom ought to make compulsory reading as a reminder of the role of the market. No, it's not a question of come over to that side. And this is what I think needs to be looked at, because similar arguments about the force of the market, that it actually liberates. It's the market is not what requires to be made social. The market is social because it challenges vested interests. It lets outsiders in. In Germany was a social democratic argument made by Ludwig Erhard, the father of the social market economy.
And one of the legacies of that entrenchment of Thatcherism of the 80s, which probably in 2013 and years to come we may have to look at, is that by polarising the argument, I think with kind of false options, we're boxing ourselves into corners which won't be terribly beneficial for either side of this House. Because if we do believe that markets not only are social and can be social, and when you look at everything Margaret Thatcher has done, she's realised that challenging the status quo, challenging vested interests, challenging outsiders and bringing them in, if we thought that that was important, then maybe we should recognise that markets are socials as well. And that leads me to why, if all she said, was it still that I can so vividly remember the moment when she left Number 10? And not like I think members on this side would have in terms of tears. To me, it was an enormous joy. It was a moment of, and I've been reflecting back and saying, why? Why did I feel so strongly? And it took me back to the Kent miners' strike. I think it was March 1995. I was in Essex, my children were small, I was listening to the radio of the whole way that very bitter final strike was ending. And I literally was in tears, and I couldn't work out why I was in tears. And I think it was because people at the bottom took an enormous hit and did the suffering for the mistakes which were made by people in power, whether it was in terms of government or whether it was in the way their trade unions were sometimes representing them. And we're repeating a way of, whether it's now happening in parts of Europe, and it'd be very interesting to see what Margaret Thatcher would make what's happening in the Eurozone. It is not the politicians who took wrong choices. It is not the people in power who made mistakes who will pay the price for those mistakes. It is the generations who have no jobs. It's the people who are unemployed. They are paying the price. And I think it was that which people associated in their minds with that period of the Thatcher government, which probably makes it that much more contentious still, whatever she did. And I think that it is one of those few figures who, on her death, the obituaries are not sufficiently balanced to really reflect her achievements and her weaknesses, which she, as she said, nobody's perfect, will have had because of that polarisation. And she will probably one of those public figures where it will take her much longer for both sides to make a true assessment. But make there no mistake, when we go out onto that into lobby and we look at the figures of prime ministers, she was one of the defining figures of the last century. I think this House should be proud that the first woman prime minister of this country will be honoured in the way I think she deserves to be honoured, as someone who served her country for longer than any other prime minister. And I think this House is quite rightly doing so as well today.
Sir Paul Beresford.
Mr. Speaker, I'll be succinct as I'm surrounded by people anxious to speak. I must congratulate the honourable lady who's just spoken. Her last paragraph or so is just exactly right, and that's how I've felt for some considerable time. Since I became a councillor in 1979, she has been someone that we've looked to, not always looked up to, but certainly looked to. And I think my honourable friend from Christchurch and my honourable friend from Malden put an aspect of it, her behaviour, her attitude of compassion, of understanding for people at the bottom, for the lowly people, has not come out. But they have both brought it out. And I certainly found that myself. I was a lowly London councillor, having trouble with English, since it's my second language. And coming from New Zealand, where politicians were at the bottom of the pile, coming from New Zealand, where if you wanted to contact the Prime Minister, you looked his phone number up in the Wellington phone book, and according to mythology, it's still there. Here, to my amazement, a polite request to see the Prime Minister explained was generally accepted. Many of the meetings that I had with the Prime Minister at my request, some at hers, and they all went through, in my day as a councillor, through the Member of Parliament for Malden as he is now. He was her political advisor, as he's explained. When it was the other way round, I could picture my honourable friend's face grinning on the phone as he rang me, and he said, "The Prime Minister would like to see you." Pause. Today. Pause. Well, at least as soon as you possibly can. And I'm sure he will recognise and remember the way to stimulate a conversation with Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister was to disagree. If you disagreed with her, her eyes lit up and she lit into the argument. If you had a proposition, or she had a proposition, she turned the discussion into an argument, a friendly argument. And my honourable friend from Auden used to sit to one side, but between us, as if a referee at Wimbledon, with his head moving from side to side with a faint grin, and you would peer out of the corner of your eye to see if you were winning. Now, as in any discussion with Margaret Thatcher at that time, you had to be very, very well prepared. I was never quite sure, when starting out at disagreeing with her, whether she was actually disagreeing with me or whether she's actually testing the hypothesis that I was putting. Now, the saying has come up several times today that the lady is not for turning, her saying. That may have been true at the particular time, but I found in practice that she would listen to an argument, particularly if there's a political aspect to it, and be prepared to change her position if the argument was suitable and was good enough. She must have, because she would not have won so many elections in a row if she had been merely dyslexic, not flexible, and not able to see the point of the argument. Yes. Which I think is why she used to spend time talking to presidents, as we've heard now, right the way through the big business people, through to the little people like me. And I do remember Lord King telling my partner, business partner, and myself that he was to see Margaret Thatcher, and he was going to tell Margaret Thatcher this, and he was going to tell Margaret Thatcher that, and he was going to tell Margaret Thatcher the other thing. And we met him 2 days after the visit, and how did it go? Oh, he said, Mrs. Thatcher told me this, and Mrs. Thatcher told me that, and Mrs. Thatcher told me the other thing. I felt good. She was also prepared to help, as many members have said, with campaigning, if we felt it was a benefit. And this I found quite extraordinary and a real insight in her ability to understand. In 1986, we had a small battle in Wandsworth. We went into an election with a majority of 1 out of a full council of 61. And Margaret Thatcher's standing in the polls, if I remember correctly, was 19 or 20%. And being a great supporter of some of the things we tried to do and did do, she offered to drop in on the campaign and support. This was politely declined. And equally politely, our thank you but no was accepted. Do remember, however, very shortly after that 19 to 20% lifted to a win at the election that shortly followed. It also, regretfully in a way, meant that we won. We went from a majority of 1 to a majority of 35. However, as ever Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister, had the last say, I received another one of those phone calls from my honourable friend, a summons to Downing Street. I then had a session of picking of brains on what Wandsworth did, the election result, and a request for an urgent full report. My honourable friend is the past master at quiet whispering in your ear so you don't miss the point. And as I left with him, he said, today is Tuesday, can we have it by Friday? And I said, look, I'm awfully sorry, John. I'm going home to pick up my bags and I'm flying out for 2 weeks. Exactly 2 weeks later, I came back, opened the doors, dropped my cases, and as I dropped the cases, the phone rang. Well, he said, have you written it yet? It's 2 weeks, we want it. And the Prime Minister in particular wants it. What I really enjoyed in the discussions with her as Prime Minister was that at the end of the discussion, generally she had made up her mind. And you were told where she stood, which is extremely useful. On one visit, I sought an audience to explain that the then Inner London Education Authority was serving an education disservice on the children of London, including those in my own borough. My wish was that the Inner London authorities could and would provide a better education for Inner London children. I had no inkling of her thinking, but she immediately made it quite clear that I was pushing at an open door. Legislation followed, and even those who once supported the ILEA think and recognise that was a good move. I came to this country and worked in East London. I came in to a country that, as someone has already said, was a sick man of Europe. We were in a desperate state. Our balance of payments were appalling. The IMF we'd gone to with a hat in hand, and all the other things that, and many of us have said tonight. Margaret Thatcher's arrival as Prime Minister couldn't have been any later, because we're on the edge. I just wish it had been sooner. Yeah.
Order. There is no formal time limit on backbench contributions today, but I would just gently point out to the House that no fewer than 48 honourable and right honourable members are still seeking to catch my eye, and I know that members will wish to tailor their contributions accordingly. Mr Barry Sherman.
I don't think you're in short trousers, but you were certainly, I think, just starting your A-levels in 1979, because I've checked on your birth date, when I got elected to the House of Commons in 79, and the same day, of course, Mrs Thatcher became Prime Minister. And imagine my astonishment when I became number one in the first Prime Minister's question, and I was going to ask the first Prime Minister's question. Unfortunately, my predecessor, Curly Maladu, died that week, and I had to withdraw from that first question. And it took me a long time to get another question to the Prime Minister. Indeed, the next time I got a high question, Willie Whitelaw was doing questions, standing in for her. And so, in 15th of April 1980, I did say, will the Prime Minister take time today to reflect on the mounting evidence emerging this week, not only from her Chancellor Exchequer, that her economic strategy is destroying Britain's industrial base? Will she further consider reversal of those policies which have led to a soaring inflation rate of 20%, rising unemployment, crippling interest rates that will soon turn this country into a banana republic, both economically and diplomatically? Mr. Speaker, I only mention this because for a number of years I was a backbencher, and for a long time a shadow minister, drilled to hate everything Mrs Thatcher stood for. And you know, over those years I came to respect Margaret Thatcher, because she commanded that dispatch box, and she was a fantastic parliamentarian. But, Mr. Speaker, we can't pretend that people didn't love and loathe her. In fact, if you look at the election result, I think more people loved her than loathed her. But you know, when I was at the London School of Economics, I did study with Michael Oakeshott. I did read Hayek, and was very much influenced by both those gentlemen. Oakeshott took me through a wonderful study of Machiavelli, both the Prince and the Discourses. And of course, what the Prince and the Discourses tell you is that for a leader, for a prince, for a Prime Minister to survive, they have to be lucky. Mrs Thatcher was both, I think, talented as a leader, but she was also lucky. I was on this side of the House, knowing what a shambles the opposition was. The fact is, we were a shambles. The fact of the matter is that we had more time fighting each other within the Labour Party than we had time to fight the government. And, Mr. Speaker, that's not good for democracy, to have such a weak opposition that we had post-1979. And I think many of the communities that sometimes we stand up and say, you know, Mrs Thatcher rolled over the Mounting Committee, she did, caused great hardship Terrible things happened to people in the mining community, in the mining communities, and I think that miners' dispute should have been ended much, much quicker than it did. And my heart went out to the wives of miners, you know, selling things and raising money and trying to keep families together. So I remember very closely, although my constituency isn't a mining constituency, it's very close to mining constituency. So I understand those people that loathed Mrs. Thatcher, but I also understand that those people at that time were let down by the democratic opposition because we couldn't get our act together to defeat Mrs. Thatcher. And I have to say, Mr. Speaker, that reflecting on what she contributed, I think she contributed to this, and some very perceptive speeches, and very good speeches, I thought. I haven't agreed with one or two on the other side, on the government side, and I haven't agreed with two or three on my own side. But the fact of the matter, if you look at what happened in 1979, it was a colossal sea change in British politics, and we needed it. We needed that post-war untidy shambles of a consensus to something to happen, radical. And Mrs. Thatcher was it. And she surprised us all because it was not conservatism, wasn't Toryism. Those people said it was Gladstonian, laissez-faire liberalism, absolutely right. That's what it was. We know that very well because that blue liberalism in West Yorkshire was well known. Absolutely understood it. And that's what she stood for. And it surprised everyone. We didn't know on this side of the house how to handle it. We really did not know how to handle it. And because of that, I think, partly because of that, she won so many, the 3 general election victories. And we were trounced. That's the truth of it. We were trounced. We were a divided party, a divided opposition, and we had a very tough and long time getting through. And I tell you, Mr. Speaker, it was Mrs. Thatcher, actually, that transformed the Labour Party. She transformed the Labour Party. We had to reform and change and get our act together, or we would have ceased to be the presence and power of a major party in our country. So I think we must remember, Mr. Speaker, what Mrs. Thatcher did for democracy. And I think for parliamentary democracy. And I want to end on this, Mr. Speaker. I actually think something like a radical change in how we regard our parliamentary democracy, we're overdue for it again. We need some voice in this chamber, I don't know which party it will come from, that actually says there's some deep inequities in our society. There's some serious problems, different than the ones that Mrs. Thatcher faced in 1979 and in the years under her prime ministership. But very deep. My right honourable friend touched on some of them. The tragic decline of our great cities, many of them in the north and the Midlands. Yeah? And that's happened all over the developed world. In the United States, just look what's happening in Detroit, look at what's happening in Pittsburgh, look what's happened. There's something deeply wrong with the way in which our societies are developing, and that's to do with a complex change in international, what we on this side would call international capitalism, the international structure of economics. There's something fundamentally happening that we have all become a bit complacent about on all sides of this House. And we are going to need somebody with the originality of Thatcher to get us to wake up to what's going on. And the last thing I'll say, we all, if we're very honest in this House, and I make this a constant theme in my speeches, I'm sorry, but most of us will admit the tiny number in our constituency parties who are actively involved in politics, in our constituencies. Tiny numbers. In a democracy where only 65% voted at the last election, 6 million people didn't even register, and we are in a democratic state of our parliamentary democracy that is quite deplorable. And I think we are going to have some with a vision, very different political basis, who's got to say, if we value this democracy, we've got to shake it up. Mr. Speaker, I spoke today because I got to admire and quite like, because she could be very pleasant, as some of my colleagues have said, very pleasant indeed. She would give you a real roasting from the dispatch box if you said something, but in that corridor out there would be very kind. That's the truth of the woman. But she was phenomenal. She did things that I deplored. She did things that I thought were wonderful. And there was a balance, and over time we'll judge just how good that was. But what we are facing today, I think, is a challenge to our democracy, and we need a Thatcher-like, not the same, but a Thatcher-like radical change in our democracy that will again wake us up to the fact that our country has challenges for which we at present have no answers.
Mr. Mike Freer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If I may turn the comments on to speaking briefly about my predecessor, the local Member of Parliament for Finchley and Friern Barnet. Many people have talked about her role on the global stage or the national stage. I wish to talk about the woman who represented Finchley for 33 years. The woman my party members remember never, ever as Maggie, but simply as Mrs. T, or more fondly as our Margaret. From the outset, Finchley Conservatives knew they had a winner. One of my stalwarts, Derek Phillips, recounts how, as a young Conservative, he went into that selection meeting saying, "I'm not voting for a woman." He came out having voted for that woman. He changed his mind in short order when she was clearly head and shoulders above the men. And from that day on, Mr. Speaker, she remained head and shoulders above the men around her. Now, much is said about Mrs. Thatcher's background. She's described often disparagingly as the grocer's daughter and housewife, who knew the value of thrift and of living in one's means, as if there was something wrong with that. For me, Mrs. Thatcher illustrates clearly and sharply what shapes our views as members of Parliament, whether it's ideology, background or our casework, and it's probably a blend of all three. Finchley and Friern Barnet was and is a suburban constituency. Mrs. Thatcher would have seen firsthand how government policies affected the lives of local families. Families who had worked hard to buy their home, or those families who struggled to make ends meet, and including the many pensioners in the constituency. When commentators describe her as driven by ideology, they fail to understand the woman. They fail to understand that the constituency was her touchstone. Now, Mr. Speaker, as might be expected, Finchley has a wealth of memorabilia. And I came across one election address dating back to '74. But I also searched for a photograph of one young Finchley student called John Burko, who I'm told approached Mrs. Thatcher at one of the hustings and was firmly told to go and join the Young Conservatives. You'll be pleased to know, Mr. Speaker, no photographic evidence exists. I have searched. But, Mr. Speaker, I did find this election address, if you'll forgive me for using a prop, dating back to 1974. And if I may highlight a few excerpts from it. She said, because this was her local election address of 1974, 40 years ago, "As a nation, we must stop living on borrowed money. We must gradually reduce the debt over a period of 3 or 4 years." That sounds familiar. "We must keep public spending within the capacity and willingness of our citizens to foot the bills." And it goes on, Mr. Speaker, to talk about helping first-time buyers with their deposits, of helping council tenants to buy their homes, and of course of easing the rates burden. And that was 40 years ago, and some would say nothing has changed. But, Mr. Speaker, the day-to-day issues that faced her as a local constituency MP, in my view, influenced her policies. Finchley was where she came to recharge her batteries. She knew that when she came to Finchley, she would leave the advisers behind. and she would hear the unvarnished truth as seen by her constituents and, equally importantly, by her supporters and her activists. One of her agents tells a story that within minutes of Mrs Thatcher returning to Downing Street, the number 10 machine would be on the phone demanding, politely, to know what she had been told in Finchley, because she had returned to Downing Street full of vigour, demanding to know what was going on with this and what was going on with that. Mr Speaker, Finchley brought home to her what needed to be done. Now, there is one incident that perhaps explains her drive to abolish the rates and introduce the community charge. And this is an example of how I believe her constituency work shaped her policies. Now, the rights and wrongs of the community charge are not for today, but the casework Mrs Thatcher came across drove home the inequality of a household with several wage earners paying the same as a pensioner. She saw firsthand the struggle many on low and fixed incomes had with the rates. And one experience I will relate. I'm told one elderly resident came to see her in a state of distress. The resident had paid her rates in cash, in an envelope, to the town hall. The cash went astray. Now, Mrs Thatcher knew the hardship having to find the rates once had caused, let alone having to find it a second time to make up the cash that had gone astray. And it's not commonly known, but Mrs Thatcher quietly sent a cheque and paid the rates for that resident. She was far from the heartless caricature portrayed in the media and by her opponents. She took enormous interest in her constituents, and her ability to remember their names and their concerns, often months after first meeting them, was truly astounding. In the early 1990s, when I was a local councillor in Finchley, Mrs Thatcher came to a summer fete held every year on a small council estate. She arrived bang on time because she was a stickler for punctuality. She swept in the Jaguar. Out she came, as immaculate as ever, and ignored, of course, the local dignitaries like humble councillors, and went straight across to the organiser of the fete, I'll call her Mrs Smith, and went straight up and said, "Now, dear, how did your daughter get on with her GCSEs? She sat them last year, didn't she? Wasn't she sitting 7? And I was completely bowled over by this, and I spoke to her agent, and I said, "Do you make copious notes while no one's looking so that you can brief her before she arrives?" And I was very firmly told, no, she simply remembers. And that was the measure of the woman as a constituency MP. She had an amazing knack of being able to put anyone at ease, usually because she knew what was important to them had to be important to her. The dripping tap the council wouldn't repair was the most important thing to that constituent, and so it became the most important thing to Mrs T. Now, there are countless examples of her warmth and her compassion. The devotion of those who worked with her and stayed with her after she was no longer the PM is testament to that. Many of her close protection officers chose to stay with her rather than move up the ranks, one of whom recently told me that of a Christmas time at Chequers, he came back to the police mess room to find that Mrs Thatcher had been in, she had tidied it up, she had decorated it with Christmas decorations, she had cleaned out the hearth and laid a fire, and she had left a flask of coffee on the table for her police officers. That is the woman few people saw. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, it was said by my noble friend Baron Baker of Dorking that we shall not see the like of her again. Well, we probably will see a woman party leader. We probably will see a woman Prime Minister again. But will we see the intellect, the drive, the passion and the core beliefs to shape events, not to bend to them? Will we see the whole package? I don't think so. Mr Speaker, our Margaret, as my members remember her, was an outstanding constituency MP. Finchley is proud to have selected her, and we are grateful to the Thatcher family for them lending her to us.
Mr. Paul Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unwisely, I once put down a written question to Prime Minister Thatcher asking her to list the failures of a premiership. The answer was disappointingly brief. Another MP put down a question asking her to list the successes of a premiership. The answer cost £4,500 and filled 23 columns of Hansard. Modesty was never her prime virtue, but she had many virtues, and I would rank her as one of the two best politicians of the last century. The other one was Clement Attlee, and it's significant that Matthew Paris tweeted about an hour ago saying that he'd come across a copy of The Guardian from October 1967 when there was a small note saying quiet funeral for Clement Attlee. And I believe that prime ministers are not made by the trappings of power or expensive funerals. There's a little story I would like to share with you, and that's a cunning plot by the late Tony Banks, who had some power over deciding statues in this house because he chaired the Arts Committee. And he commissioned a statue of Mrs. Thatcher that was the right dimensions to fit into one of the empty niches outside in the members' lobby there, and it was meant to go there. It was exactly the right dimensions, and it was in white marble. Unfortunately, that statue was decapitated, but I believe the cunning plan of Tony Banks was to have the statue put up there in the hope that the bronze statue would go to another Prime Minister who is possibly not held in the same respect today. She wasn't like most politicians, and we all pretend that we act on the basis of evidence and sense and reason. But I'm afraid most politicians, and apart from Clement Attlee and Margaret Thatcher primarily, act on the basis of pressure, of prejudice and perception. Those are the things that move us. Those that determine what laws go through the House. But she was a woman who knew about evidence. She knew about scientific evidence, and that was the reason she was one of the first to embrace the Green Agenda. She was someone who I believe was very wrong in many of her things that she did. And my main reason for speaking is to make the point about what happened to my constituents. And I believe that absolutely right. No one's going to question the need for greater financial discipline from the 70s into the 80s. Industries were in a mess. But the great tragedy with Mrs. Thatcher, and it happens to many leaders when they stay long, is that they're surrounded by sycophants, by people who praise them extravagantly. And the result is usually based. We've had a great deal of it today, I'm afraid. I think there's a great deal that's entirely true that's been said. But there's been a huge amount of hyperbole also. But the result is that what follows is hubris for the person in charge. And hubris is followed by nemesis. And I believe with Margaret Thatcher, in the way that she treated heavy industry in this country, had taken a mission that she had to discipline the industries, to make them profitable, but she didn't know when to stop. I think particularly of the industry that was the backbone of my city of Newport, which is the steel industry, which is now a pale shadow of its former self. And I'm afraid that Margaret Thatcher didn't fight for heavy industry in the way she fought for the farming industry or for the financial industry. And the result is a terrible one, because it meant that many of the people who worked in that industry, who had special skills, who devoted their life to it, who defined themselves as steel workers, suddenly had their skills made redundant. They were no longer important. They were robbed of that scrap of dignity that we all need need to build our lives around. And I believe that what she did was to go too far, and we know the result of that. There is great respect for her as a political personality, but I believe that history will judge her as a great Prime Minister. But one of the other virtues that are put forward today may be seen by most people here as a great virtue, and that's her role, which was to alter the appearance, the respect, the persona of England rather than Wales or Scotland in the world. But there is a cost to that, and the cost of punching above our weight militarily is that we spend beyond our interests and we die beyond our responsibilities. I'd like to say finally, Mr. Speaker, there are two deaths I think we should be talking about today. Of course, Mrs. Thatcher, but I think we should also have a mention of Lance Corporal Jamie Webb of the 1st Mercian Regiment. He was 24, he died on the 25th of last month, and he was repatriated to this country last week, on Thursday. I don't know if anyone saw any publicity, any attention to that. He was the 441st casualty death of our soldiers in the Afghan war. But because of the arrangements now at Brize Norton, which I visited, and they're very sensitively conceived, one can think of any way in which there could be arrangements that could give comfort to the grieving relatives of those who've fallen in the name of this country. But I'm afraid the way that the procession takes place now is designed to avoid any attention to these tragedies. And we should remember today, along with Margaret Thatcher, the names of those who died, 441 of them. One of them, Jamie Webb, who died for this country. We should remember their sacrifice, and we should be working to ensure that the spirit that means that we try to punch our weight often has tragic ends.
Mr. Simon Hughes.
Mr. Speaker, it's a privilege to have been here today and to be able to pay tribute to Margaret Thatcher. And firstly, on behalf of not just me and party colleagues, but many of my constituents, I'm sure, to pass on condolences through the Prime Minister to her family, to her extended family, to her close friends, and to all those who've worked with her in the Conservative Party. I think there have been two themes that have come out already. Firstly, a wish to show that condolence and sympathy, but also an admiration and respect from across the House, irrespective of party, for somebody who is clearly one of the dominant political figures, not just of this country, but of democratic politics in the Western world in the last century. One of the strongest and clearly one of the most determined leaders of our country that we've ever known. Mrs. Thatcher was born, like my late mother, in the great and productive county of Lincolnshire, and given that she also had the same birth date as my dad, the 30th of October, it's not surprising that once she came into the Heath cabinet, we watched her career with a bit more than usual interest. She'd already set many examples to follow, referred to by colleagues. An example to young people, she stood first at the age of 24 to come to this place. An example to people who don't succeed the first time, because she actually had to have 3 goes before she got here, and then becoming her party's leader before the age of 50. I remember hearing when she became leader, standing at the railway station in Bruges when I was doing a postgraduate year at the College of Europe, and when Ted Heath was defeated, and I was very clear from that moment on that that was a very significant moment in British political history. It caused a bit of a dispute in our family. Like many families, my dad wasn't keen. My mum was much more admiring of her. But she clearly did, and many colleagues have referred to this, by her very efforts, change the place of women in British public life and politics. I checked the figures. Before she was elected, there'd been no general election with more than 200 female candidates, no general election where more than 30 women had been elected to this place. In 1992, the election when she stood down, there were 571 female candidates and 60 women were elected to this place, and numbers went on significantly after that. She wouldn't want to say there was a direct cause and effect, but I'm clear there was a cause and effect, and thank God for that. It was also significant in her election that a scientist became a party leader and a Prime Minister, and her forensic skills and scientific interest were evident. Her interest in climate change and the worries of it, I'm sure, came from that. And when she won the 1979 election, that was the second time there was clearly a most defining moment in history. We had, and I hope colleagues on the opposition benches don't try to airbrush this, we'd had a very dire few years economically in this country. And it had not been a happy time going to be rescued from the international community for finance. The lights had been out in the early part of the decade. We'd only been working 3 days a week, so it wasn't as if there'd been some great halcyon days in the 70s. And she then delivered not just 3 election victories, 2 of which had majorities of over 100, always with 13 million or more votes, always with more than 42% of the electorate supporting her. But she also, I noticed, and I pay tribute to her successor in Finchley, also ending up in her last election in Finchley having the highest vote she ever got in the constituency, which I think is testimony to the way she was respected in her constituency in North London. I came here in 1983 in the by-election when she was Prime Minister, and I'd always believed till then that all Prime Ministers and governments do good things, in fact many good things, but don't do everything right. Some things clearly right, some things clearly wrong. And I came here as a member of the broader Christian church, as she did, and I realised I'd have a difficulty from the beginning because we're called Christians and many people of other faiths to love everybody, but sometimes loving Mrs. T was a bit difficult from the opposition benches. She was clearly right in the attitude she took, for example, to the Falklands. Absolutely right to be determined and recapture the Falklands for Britain. She was clearly courageous beyond expectation in her determination not to be blown off course by the despicable IRA bomb in Brighton in 1984. And she was almost unbelievably successful in her work to bring down the Iron Curtain. I worked out, after she died this week, that there were 19 occasions when I engaged with her across the House between 83 and the final debate in November 1990. On one of them I was able to thank her for supporting the work on the Rose Theatre, which had been excavated. She did have an interest in culture and the wider arts. There were 2 occasions when I had to have a strong go at her over London matters. There was a need to reform London government, but abolishing the GLC was absolutely not the way to go. There was a need to mobilise the docklands and urban areas for regeneration, but having no democratic participation was not the way to go. And then there were other issues which were good ideas in part, but often left things in some ways worse off than before. Allowing people the right to buy their own council homes was popular, in many ways a good idea, but not giving councils the power to decide whether they wanted to use that power was wrong in my view. Not to make the discounts reflect accurately the length of time somebody had been there was inappropriate, and certainly not guaranteeing that all the monies went back to the councils was extremely unhelpful. I'm clear that is one of the causes of the real shortage of social and affordable housing, council housing and others today. Mrs. Thatcher was right to take on the trade unions, which had become overmighty in the 70s, but she was wrong to do it in a way that decimated much of the manufacturing industry, not just in our coal mines, but in other places like South Wales as a result. She was right to work, as she did, successfully, to bring down the inflation rate from 13% in 79 to 5% or less in 5 of the next 10 years, but presiding over unemployment going up from 4% to over 9% was not a price worth paying and had serious adverse consequences. And although pensioners were better off in terms of the amount of money in their retirement, the fact that she'd broken the link with earnings was something many pensioners never forgave her for. The thing that I took up with her was the issue that I took up with her in her very last speech, Sadly, she had left the gap between the rich and the poor much wider at the end of the Tory government than when it began. I have to say the Labour government then continued that. She accused me of saying that we would rather the poor were poorer provided the rich were less rich. That wasn't ever our view, but we needed a fairer society, and sadly we didn't have one. Mr. Speaker, I referred to Bruges at the beginning. I want to end with the Bruges speech which she made 25 years ago this year, because the Bruges speech bears rereading, as I'm sure the Prime Minister has done on more than one occasion. And I end with quotes exactly her words as given to the college of which I was privileged previously to be a student. Our destiny is in Europe as part of the community. That's not to say that our future lies only in Europe. The community is not an end in itself. The European community is a practical means by which Europe can ensure the future prosperity and security of its people in a world in which there are many other powerful nations and groups of nations. Certainly, we want to see Europe more united and with a greater sense of common purpose. Europe is stronger when we work more closely together, whether it be in trade, in defence, in our relations and with the rest of the world. But it must be in a way that preserves the different traditions, for these have been the source of Europe's vitality through the countries. We're proud of her patriotism, we give thanks for that, and she is absolutely somebody who will be respected throughout the whole of the rest of our political lives.
Mr. David Lammy.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to pay tribute to Baroness Thatcher and to associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition. Mr. Speaker, it is an incredibly long way from Broadwater Farm via the bar to being here as a Member of Parliament. I think it's an even further way from a grocer's in Grantham through Oxbridge and the bar to leading your country as a woman. And for that single reason, it is very appropriate that we come together to pay tribute to Margaret Thatcher. Now, I look at her legacy from the vantage point of being one of the young people growing up with a single parent, occasionally reliant on the state and certainly on benefits in Tottenham during a very difficult time for our country. And it would certainly be the case that for most of my youth, Margaret Thatcher was not somebody I admired, and there was on occasions when I actually felt quite scared by much that she said and her government seemed to do. I have to say, 20, 25, 30 years later, I feel slightly different. My political generation, which would include the leaders of our political parties, coincides with a period in politics of 24-hour media, presentation, soundbite, spin, polling, and in a sense, all of us in this House have met politicians that seem not really to know their own mind. We've met politicians that say one thing 1 minute, and then when they've met someone else seem to say the last thing of someone who's just spoken to them. Some of us have even met party leaders that are like that. In that context, I have tremendous respect for someone with conviction and courage, willing to stand their ground, clear on their values base. And at this time in our country's history, where things are so hard and where there is so much deep concern about our political class, we could do with more conviction from all sides of this House. I have said that I very much base my remarks from growing up in Tottenham, but for the second part of my youth I spent 7 years in Peterborough, and there I came across a different kind of working class attitude to Margaret Thatcher. These were people who had left London, gone to a new town, were making their way and very much wanting to forge ahead in Britain. They were enjoying holidays for the first time. They were owning their homes for the first time. You went round to their small houses and they had on the coffee table a Tell Cid brochure. Keen were they to take part in this experiment of buying shares in British Gas. I have to say, my mum got one of those brochures just to put on her coffee table, but this was just to appear as if she might be able to buy shares in British Gas. And I think it is right to say that if we look at the 20th century and we think of the two quiet revolutions in the 20th century that give us the country and the world that we have today, those two revolutions are the social liberal revolution of the 1960s, perhaps best personified by that quest for freedom and human rights that we would associate with another great elder statesman, Nelson Mandela. But the second liberal revolution must most definitely be the economic revolution, liberal revolution of the 1980s. Margaret Thatcher is obviously at the absolute epicentre of that revolution, and it is for that reason that she is a giant figure in terms of our history, and it is right that our country comes together to pay her that due respect. However, I'm afraid there is a big however, because we also live with the consequences of a hyper-individualised society. Consequences that we see in a materialism, a consumerism, an over-corporatism, and a sense that unemployment is fine, that those on benefits can fend for themselves. And I do want to just remind the House that for people in Handsworth, in Brixton, in Tottenham, in St Paul's in Bristol, in Moss Side in Manchester, in Chapeltown in Leeds, this was a desperate, desperate time with tremendous suffering, and we stand in solidarity with colleagues in the north, particularly in our mining towns and former steelworks, who really bear the scars today of that period of social adjustment. I might also say, no one has mentioned the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth is an important institution, and that Margaret Thatcher, despite the advice of Rajiv Gandhi, of people like Oliver Tambo and others urging economic sanctions, could basically say, no, I will go it alone, is a great scar on the history of the Commonwealth. So that history will be checkered, it will go on for many years. It is right that we pay tribute, but it is also right that we reflect on young people growing up, particularly in our tower blocks and estates, at that time, and the suffering that they are now still going through, because not of a feral underclass, but a workless poor that begun in that period and still continues for successive generations today.
Order. If everyone is to get in, speeches of no more than 4 minutes will be required. I appeal to honourable and right honourable members to help me to help them. Mr. Charles Walker.
Mr. Speaker, I shall try to be brief. I didn't know Lady Thatcher. I met her on a few occasions, but I admired her from afar. And I am here today to pay my respects and to pass on the respects of many tens of thousands of my constituents who would want me to be here today. She was a great woman, a great Prime Minister, and had a love of this country emblazoned on her heart.
Yeah. Mr. David Anderson.
Mr. Speaker, as a former coal miner who became a care worker in the 1980s and took care of frail elderly people, particularly frail elderly women who suffered things like dementia, incontinence, the inability to dress themselves, the inability to bathe themselves, I have nothing but empathy for the family of Margaret Thatcher today. They will feel an immense sense of loss, and this will almost certainly also be tinged with a sense of relief. And they'll feel guilty about that relief, but they shouldn't, because it's a normal and healthy attitude when a loved one is being brought low by the reality of our own mortality. But we remiss of me today, as a former miner, as a former trade union leader, and as a member of a constituency whose history is built on hard work of ordinary men and women, not to record the reality of life for the people in those constituencies because of the policies promoted by Margaret Thatcher. She came to power promising to bring harmony where there was discord. Well, I can safely say in the mining communities up and down the country, she brought the opposite. Most mining areas were stable, secure, safe communities where we worked hard and played hard. We didn't complain about the difficult conditions we worked in. All we asked was for the chance to carry on doing that work. We built communities over decades, in some cases over centuries, that had stood the test of time. We built sports centres, swimming pools, we built cricket clubs, football clubs, we built libraries, developed brass bands, we ran art classes that gained international fame, part and parcel of our culture. But none of this seemed to matter to Margaret Thatcher. She believed that we were no longer any use to the nation because we were deemed to be uneconomic. But on what basis was that case made? I believe the main reason why the United Kingdom coal industry was classed as uneconomic was because we insisted on running safe coal mines in this country, unlike coal mines in the rest of the world. And we had a history going back longer than other industries, other coal industries, that was littered with numerous examples of avoidable deaths. And we as a country agreed to invest in the best quality equipment in the world and in training people to produce coal as safely as possible. And one of the great disgraces in this country today is we import over 50 million tonnes of coal a year for countries where men are killed literally in the thousands. When we closed down an industry that was safest and most technically advanced in the world. There's still blood on the coal that's being burnt in British power stations, but it's American blood, it's Russian blood, it's Chinese blood, it's Colombian blood. So to some extent, that's okay. Well, it shouldn't be okay when we still in a country that has millions of tonnes of coal underneath our feet. But the other area where the so-called economic justification falls down was the failure of Margaret Thatcher and her government to take into account the social cost of communities such as mine, where no alternative employment was put forward for those people who were losing their jobs, and particularly for their children. The village where I lived had seen coal mining for almost 2 centuries. In a matter of months after closure, we were gripped by a wave of petty crime, burglary, car crime, mostly related drugs. But we've never recovered from it. I've got to tell you, Mr. Speaker, when you wake up in the middle of the night and you go downstairs because your home's being burgled and you find out the next day that it was the son of one of your best friends who'd done it, it puts in perspective a community that was built on reliance and taking care of each other. It really does take a lot of recovering from. That was compounded by the decision in 1988, a crass decision to sell off houses that had been owned by the National Coal Board to private landlords. Private landlords bought these houses and brought in people from outside the area who had no respect for the community, no respect for the houses they were given. And 20 years later, houses that had been sold for £4,000 to private landlords were bought back by the council for £60,000 of public money to pull them down because of the failure of that policy that had been agreed some 20 years before as part and parcel of the decision to ruin the coal industry in this country. A lot has been said over the last 48 hours about the harsh nature of some of the responses to the news of Mrs Thatcher's death. But this House needs to understand the reason for that. Because before, during and ever since the attack on the coal industry and the people in it, the government of both colours were warned of the impact of that policy. We've seen the reaction of people whose frustration is heartfelt because they've lost their sense of place in society. They're being made to feel worthless. They're being cast aside like a pair of worn-out pit boots. They've seen the community fall apart. They've seen their children's opportunities disappear, and they've not been listened to. And sadly, some of that has boiled over this week. After today's debate, these people may never be listened again. And Mrs Thatcher's lack of empathy, her intransigence, a failure to see the other side, a refusal to even look at the other side, has left them bitter and resentful, and they're hitting out in a way that is uncharacteristic of minors in their communities. Her accusation that the enemy within was in the mining areas of this country still rankles people. I wasn't an enemy within. The member for Midlothian wasn't. The member for Wansbeck wasn't. The member for Blythe wasn't. The member for Biggar wasn't. But neither people like Joe Green, killed on the picket line at Ferrybridge in Yorkshire, or David Jones, who was killed at Ollerton Colliery, or Terry Leaves or Jimmy Jones, who were killed in South Wales, or 3 young boys, Darren Holmes, aged 15, Paul Holmes, aged 14, and Paul Wumsley, aged 14, who died scavenging for coal to try and keep the fire on, to keep the family warm. So it's understandable that people feel bitter when we're here today to remember the legacy of Mrs Thatcher. All we wanted was the right to work. We didn't just want it for ourselves, we wanted it for our kids, and that was took away. The funeral next week takes place 20 years to the day that Easington Colliery was closed. Please don't blame the people in my part of the world if they chose that day to pay their tribute in a very different way to has been paid in this house today.
Mr Andrew Tyree.
A number of others, the deep emotions that Margaret Thatcher still inspires. The reason that there are so many of us still on this side of the House is quite simply because she was the inspiration for so many of us to go into politics in the first place. There was her sense of public service and duty, her conviction that even the toughest task could be tackled, including Britain's ungovernability, her conviction that the state had lost sight of its essential role of protecting our freedoms, was now encroaching on them and must be rolled back. And above all, there was her patriotism. She wanted to restore pride in our country and others' respect for it. I think as far as the last century is concerned, she'll come to be seen as the greatest standard bearer for freedom this House has produced. My first meaningful encounter with her took place at 7:15 a.m. in a windowless back room in Conservative Central Office just before a press conference during the 1984 European elections. Having only been at Central Office for a few months, I was unnerved to find myself placed opposite her. She had, it seemed, read all the extensive briefing we'd prepared for her. She fixed me with a stare. Her first question identified an apparent contradiction in the briefing. Before I had time to admit I didn't know why, Geoffrey Howe, who was sitting next to me and did, saved me by replying. She was kind enough to add me to a lunch party after those elections at Chequers. No doubt identifying me as the junior man, she told me to sit next to her for lunch. Within minutes, she had announced to the table that I was far too thin, and she insisted on overseeing my consumption of 2 puddings. I met her. I don't think I better comment on that. I met her sporadically over the following few years. In that period, I was in the Treasury, and I had a ringside seat for the Thatcher-Lawson row, the rights and wrongs of which, and they were both, are for another day. More generally, I had a chance to observe several of her well-known traits. At the heart of her approach was her instinctive understanding that the restoration of prosperity depended on supply-side reform, breaking down entrenched privileges of the professions as much as the trades unions, simplifying and reducing taxes, cutting back the tangle of regulation, and enhancing individual opportunity and aspiration. She wanted to break with the consensus of an overmighty state and a dependent people. Some have been arguing recently, that Mrs Thatcher's reforms are responsible for the failings of the banks today. I doubt that. Whatever the merits of the prudential regulation that came with Big Bang in the 80s, those rules were no longer in place when the crisis broke 5 years ago. They've been replaced by another set of rules put there in the 1990s, both in the US and the UK. In any case, the notion that Mrs. Thatcher, who cared most of all about the consumer and the taxpayer, would be an apologist for the banks is implausible. She would have found the abuse of market power by some bank leaderships for their own gain at the expense of the rest of us every bit as deplorable as the behaviour of trade union leaders. Most of Mrs. Thatcher's legacy on the supply side survives, although her supply side reforms were, to some degree, reversed by the last government. And perhaps I should take this opportunity to say that, in my view, the importance of the supply side is still not yet fully recognised by this administration. Mr. Speaker, it has been said today that her judgment faltered at the end, and there was perhaps a touch of that hubris which always lurks in Number 10's bunker after a long stay. And of course, the pain of her reforms still linger. Over the longer view, I think none of that will detract from her legacy. What will linger in the memory is the single most extraordinary achievement of any leader in the post-war era, that of turning a failing country and a basket case economy into a country that had recovered its self-respect and had a future.
Geraint Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I speak from the perspective of someone who was a 14-year-old schoolboy in South Wales when Margaret Thatcher became leader, and a representative, obviously, of Swansea West constituency. And obviously, Mrs. Thatcher was a person of steely determination and focus, who didn't care about the ebbs and flows of opinions or focus groups, but had a strategic vision to deliver change, and that's good. But I feel she should be judged on her own terms by whether she did deliver harmony where there was discord, whether she delivered hope where there was despair. And I feel, certainly in terms of South Wales, she failed on those two counts, and whether she delivered a better Britain. She did for some and she didn't for others. Obviously her leadership was born in the trauma of the economic and political trauma of the 1970s, where we saw inflation over 25% thanks to oil price increases. We saw the miners' strike getting rid of Ted Heath. We saw a Labour government which was held together by Lab Pact, moving forward to trying to bring down inflation through pay relationships with the trade unions, and had some success approaching 1978. But according to my predecessor, Alan Williams, the former Father of the House, Callaghan said, I think we can have another round of pay restraint, and the unions won't want to instead have Margaret Thatcher as the new Prime Minister. How wrong he was. We went into the coldest winter for 16 years. Strikes lasted till February. Election was called after a vote of no confidence. And of course Saatchi's then brought forward Labour isn't working and delivered Margaret Thatcher. Sort of cruel irony really, because unemployment went up from 1.5 million to 3.2 million between 1979 and 1983, and that was the human cost of bringing inflation down by 4%, and that certainly didn't deliver a harmony at all. She was deeply unpopular then, and had it not been for the Labour left being split, the SDP, of course, broke away in 1981, got 25% of the vote in 1983, alongside the Liberals in the alliance, compared with 28% for Labour. Had it not been for that, and of course the Falklands War, she might not have got in 1983. And when she did, of course, her first focus was to settle the scores with the miners that had brought down Ted Heath. And she put the coal stocks up in that winter of 83 and 84. She announced there would be closures, the National Coal Board would be privatised, sold off. And of course Scargill fell into the bear trap. He didn't hold a vote. We had a 12-month strike. A third of the pits were still working. And we saw the destruction of a great mining industry that's already been described. We're all currently, as has been said, consuming 50 million tonnes of coal a year. There's no coal industry. Near where I am, the Tower Colliery cooperative, where the miners bought their own mine, operated successfully for 10 years. But in those communities, they've been sort of left on their own in despair, without support. And that isn't very much the politics of hope, but the politics of fear, as Bevan put it. So when we look at
economic Thatcherism, if you like. It isn't just a matter of using unemployment to keep down wages, to keep down unions. It's a matter of obviously mass privatisation, and the proceeds of that privatisation, crucially, the £70 billion, alongside the £80 billion from the oil, wasn't used to renew our industrial infrastructure, to renew our hospitals, to renew our transport and our schools as it should have been. That was one of the squandering legacies. Instead, we ended up in a situation where money was being used to keep people on the dole, to provide tax breaks. We ended up with an unmanaged oil system where exchange rates kept manufacturing was actually declining at a much faster rate than it should have been. Ultimately, she got re-elected through the Lawson bubble that burst, and in the final chapter, of course, she tried, at the time the rich were getting richer, she said, oh, well, why don't the poor and the rich pay the same tax for local services, the poll tax? And as we saw the grey smoke emerge from the violent protests in London, the grey suits went round Lady Thatcher and wanted to elect a grey leader, John Major, of course, who, of course, managed to get in. Obviously, since then, everything naturally broke down, and we ended up with a new government, reinvested the proceeds of growth in new schools and new hospitals and new opportunity. But I fear that some of the legacy of Thatcher will be to go back and say, well, everything she did was right. And what she didn't do was to deliver what she should have done, which is harmony, a unity, a future that works, a future that cares, and not a divided nation. And I very much hope that we won't continue to press along this road of division and austerity, but build a new future.
Thank you very much.